Hey, this is Mark Altman of Inglorious Treksperts in the 430 movie. And if you're a fan of our podcast, you don't want to miss Deck 78, available now by subscribing at TREKPSERTSHOLIDAY.com. This is a bonus podcast full of great discussions about popular culture, film, and television. By your command, here's a sneak peek.
She was putting out literal fires. You know, like there were a lot of the people working on the film were having like nervous breakdowns, you know, because they were away from their families for 6 months. You know, like, I mean, like it's a lot to juggle, you know, and everybody I talked to, you know, said that she just, you know, she did it masterfully, and, you know, it felt very familial. If, you know, it didn't feel like a cold kind of, you know.
No, it's how people used to describe Cubby Broccoli. He knew how to take care of the cast. Well, at least they knew how to take care of the principal cast and the American crew and the British crew. It's like you have these stories about these poor Mexican extras out in the desert, 108 degrees in their still suits, who would then have to walk home and have no water. And it's horrifying, you know, it's just awful.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
they could always sip from the catch pockets in their suits. So, to be fair,
I always thought it would have been funny if when Sting and Kyle were fighting at the end, if like Sting like punctured Kyle's suit and just a big stream of shit came out of it. But
that's in the Alan Smithy
version. Look forward to in Dune 2 from Denis Villeneuve.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's definitely going to be in there. But no, like, what you just said, like, you know, talking about, you know, the plight of, you know, all these poor Mexican extras, you know, a lot of whom were vagrants, basically, who are being paid in shoes, you know, like that's not the kind of thing you get to read in a studio sanctioned.
No.
But
unfortunately, that's one of the perks that they had working down in Churubusco.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of the reasons why they were there, because they could get very cheap extra crew members.
Yeah, they made a $70 or $80 million movie for 45 million. Yeah, whatever.
But the flip side of that is you also tell a story about how Tony and Bob and Raffaella hire all these women off the street who basically can't afford to support their families, and they throw work at them. And then they keep having them, even when they run out of work, they keep giving them stuff to do to keep them on the payroll.
Right.
So that they can, and they said they would basically take a bullet for these people because they were so grateful, you know, for them. Basically, they were making more money than they ever made in their lives and able to support their families and get, you know, off the street, you know, and into, you know, and work for the studio. And some of them still have, you know, careers in the Mexican film industry because of the opportunities they got on Dune.
Yeah, everything is relative. You know, it's like, like. So
subscribe today at TREKSPERTSPlus.com and don't miss a single episode of Deck 78. Fire the rockets.
Sleigh bells ring. Are you listening? In the lane, snow is glistening. A beautiful sight. We're happy tonight. Walking in a winter wonderland. Gone away is the bluebird. Here to stay is a new bird. He sings a love song as we go along. Walking in a winter wonderland.
Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
This is Darren Doctorman.
This is Ashley Miller.
And we are the Inglorious
Treksperts Holiday Specials with special guest star Robert Meyer Burnett.
I'm very excited to be here.
The man so nice, we named him three times.
Yes.
We're also a starship with 2 missing crew members, or because both Ashley and Rob are down in sickbay. They've been bitten by the bug.
Well, luckily, Zoom is
the
available to any patient.
Not the big C,
screen.
and by that I mean chlamydia. You know,
it's not chlamydia, syphilis. But no, I went from the Star Trek reference to the Diamonds Are Forever reference. I've lost control of my referencing. It's all out of control.
Norman
Bitten by the bug. If God had meant for man to fly, Mr. Wint, he would have given him wings, Mr. Kidd. Even a shitty Bond movie has great lines.
It's true.
That's why I think most of us who are, I don't want to say old school Star Trek fans. I should say good school Star Trek fans are also huge James Bond fans.
Yes.
Because,
they sprout from similar seeds.
They do. Sean
and I would like to see what becomes one day of the seed. Once we water it.
Once we've, there's something about this that's going to.
Okay, I'm going to take a survey. By the way, I don't know if you saw on Trek Movie today. They had talked about Nick Meyer and talking about it again, his podcast about the con on the prison planet, say Alpha 5. Who thinks this thing will actually ever happen? Raise your hands.
Well, not me, but it's too bad because it's really good.
He's still saying, well, if the podcast is ahead, I think that they'll make it.
They should have made it.
Yeah, well, the window, like a door opening and closing, is
that
closed.
That ship has sailed.
Yeah. Look, he's earned the right to do Star Trek again. I mean, he's not just the man who saved Star Trek. He did it multiple times.
That's right. I mean, in the alternate future where Brian Fuller made his discovery, then I'm sure that Nick Meyer would have made his con show.
Oh my God, that's an episode. We should do an episode in the multiverse. What would have happened if Brian had not been doing American Gods and had continued to do Discovery? What would have happened? What would have happened next? How the Star Trek universe would be completely different today.
Well, Nick Meyer is the credited author of the second episode of Discovery, although not in the final version, he wasn't.
Right.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
it's appalling how they treated him.
Yeah. And it's definitely fodder for discussion.
We're back. We're back with the third installment of our holiday specials. We're doing 10 for 10. These are 10 top 10 lists of 10 different Star Treks from the Star Trek universe. Episode 1 was the 10 greatest Star Trek seasons. Episode 2 was the 10 greatest Star Trek, I can't say it, adversaries. Adversaries? How'd you say it?
Adversaries.
How does Sean say it?
Adversary.
Happy adversary. Happy adversary. Happy adversary. Sorry.
And today, in episode 3 out of 10, we're doing the best Star Trek books. 10 great Star Trek books. And just if you think that's going to go by too quickly when you've come to expect 6-hour broadcasts from us, we're pleased to tell you we're doing nonfiction and fiction in one jam-packed episode.
So in a sense, there's going to be 11 top 10 lists.
That's right.
You could say that. I guess you could say that.
And the weird thing is, it's nonfiction about fiction. So it's also pretty meta.
That's right. It's nonfiction about fiction.
Yeah.
That's the best kind.
Exactly. Speaking of which, I'm reading Peter Biskin's new book, Pandora's Box, about the rise and fall of peak TV. Yeah. And it's quite good. I highly recommend it.
All right.
Yeah. And speaking of highly recommending, has everybody checked out Opposable Thumbs about Siskel and Ebert? That just came out. And I have that sitting on my coffee table, looking forward to reading it.
I didn't know that was coming out.
I had no idea. I want to check that out.
I give it
too busy reading Star Trek books for this broadcast.
That's right.
It's not a broadcast. What is a podcast? It's not a broadcast. What is it? What do you call it?
Well, it is a broadcast, but it came from the original Apple iPod.
That's right. And the name stuck.
Yeah.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So
it was the
first iPod gave the name to podcasts.
That's correct.
Yep. Huh. That's really interesting.
Because it was something that you could subscribe and that it would automatically download to your iPod each week or whatever increments.
Something you could transplant.
That's right.
Wow. I learned something today on the TREKSPERTS.
Oh, that's what we're here for.
Everyone.
Yeah. Wow. And I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more because we're going to be talking about Star Trek fiction, Star Trek nonfiction. And there's nobody better to talk about this than Robert Meyer Burnett and Darren and Ashley, who are well schooled and having read so many of these books. And it's a fascinating thing. Darren, tell me about Star Trek fiction. When did you first, what did it mean to you? I mean, it goes back to Mac Reynolds and The Mission to Horatius, which was a terrible book that was written.
It was an awful book, but it was the first book that I found in my school library that had Star Trek on it. And that painting on the dust jacket was amazing. And I read it and I was completely disappointed, but it was still fun because it had purple letters.
One of my favorite things when I was researching for 50-Year Mission and was going through all the old Star Trek files, I came across one of the, if I'd done my homework, I would have pulled it for this broadcast, pulled the memo. But there's a memo from, because it was written contemporaneous with the second season, and there's a memo to Gene Roddenberry from John Meredith Lucas saying, I've read this, and this has nothing to do with the show. It has Uhura singing Negro spirituals, and it's just so inappropriate and not what our show is, and it lacks the sense of social equity and everything that we've tried to put into the show. And
it's sort of like a 50-year preview of Discovery.
But it was interesting that at the time it meant so much to even the people working on the show that they were weighing in, and of course that changed over the years, because even though people on the show had the opportunity to review, it was really basically like people like Richard Arnold who were designated by somebody like Gene to become the keeper of the flame. And then he passed, and it was Paramount Licensing that would review these books and weigh in with notes or comments, or you can't do this in a Star Trek novel, or this conflicts with something else that's happening. But it's interesting because all these people, John Ordover, Margaret Clark, all these people, were passionate Star Trek fans.
Yeah.
Same with John Van Citters too, later on.
That's true.
Sure. I'd have to say, like Darren, I discovered my first Star Trek novel. Now, I should say novel because my dad used to read the Blish adaptations to me when I was a little kid.
Which, interestingly, are they nonfiction or are they fiction?
Well,
are they fiction? Are they nonfiction?
But the Derpa or the Anwoon?
But the thing was, I was, I don't remember if it was kindergarten or first grade that I discovered Blish's Spock Must Die novel also in my elementary school library. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about Star Trek fiction, now tie-in fiction is ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. But at the time, Star Trek was already canceled when I was watching it.
Yeah.
And even as a kid, I understood there was never going to be any more of Star Trek. So finding Star Trek novels that were released by the same people that had released Blish's novelizations of the episodes legitimized it for me. Mm. So from the very beginning as a little kid, these were real Star Trek. They were just presented in a different format. And I never once thought to myself, well, this isn't canon.
Right.
I was in, because stuff that I recognized, Spock Must Die, they were returning to the Guardian of Forever and, all the Klingons, and they were doing all kinds of things. And I'm like, okay, this is legit. Mm. And through the 70s, the Star Trek novels that Bantam published were of varying degrees, stuff like The Starless World or World Without End.
Devil World by Gordon Eklund.
Devil World, or Kathleen Sky's Vulcan, which was god-awful. And
the Galactic Whirlpool.
That was probably the most legit because, David Gerald wrote that. I actually thought that was quite a good novel. And he had
DC Fontana, too, wrote her, which was quite good.
That was later.
Oh, right. That was her
She wrote that in the 80s. Yeah.
Right.
So, you had there were different eras of Star Trek fiction. There was the 70s, there was the 80s, because it moved from Bantam over to pocket books with the motion picture, where it stayed until they're still publishing the books now, but we can talk about it a little later. I would argue that the demise of Star Trek fiction, we actually saw it happen because of the new Star Trek TV shows destroyed the continuity that the novels have been following for over 20 years, which is really sad. But for me as a young Star Trek fan, these were legitimate Star Trek stories. And I, in my mind, did not differentiate between them, the legitimacy of these stories, to the TV show. And because I was young, nobody could sit there and tell me, well, that's not canon. And I'm like, what does that even mean? I didn't know what that meant. So if you told me that, I'd be like, cannon, what is that? Like on a pirate ship? You're going to use a cannon to hit? What does that mean?
It's canyon.
So I think that was a really interesting in the 70s. The only new Star Trek that we were getting were novels.
Right.
That was it. And what was so interesting was that Judy Lynn Del Rey and Frederick Pohl, you had these major sci-fi luminaries who were running Bantam, and these books were huge sellers. Yeah. It was a huge cash cow. This is back when Star Trek, there wasn't a ton of licensed Star Trek, but whatever there was hugely successful. I mean, if you've listened to Alan D. Forster on the show, you know that, he was under pressure when he got through all the animated episodes to stop doing 3 a book, to do 1 a book so that they would last longer, so they could keep publishing them. And I think that was my gateway to the Star Trek fiction. And then, of course, I read the Blishes, and then I read, and I was so excited about Spock Must Die, only to be unexcited by the time I finished it. And Spock Messiah was even worse. But I think the Bantam stuff, is very hit or miss, because some of it's actually pretty good.
Yeah. No, it's really, really interesting.
And the covers were gorgeous.
But what was...
I want to speak to the covers, because that was one of the great moments when I was at my local library, not the school library, but the big people's library, and discovered the Blish, I believe it was number 8, with that amazing red painting on the cover with the lone Starfleet officer and the Enterprise going above. I went, oh my God. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was a Star Trek that was bigger and bolder and more amazing than we'd ever seen on TV. And it told of adventures unlimited.
Yeah, no, and those paintings were amazing. Like the one where you had, Who Mourns for Adonais, the hand, right? With you had God in space. That was a great painting. But the Starless World, the original cover for the Starless World, not the reprint, with the Enterprise over, it was really just over like a landscape of farmland, but put in a sphere. And I'm like, wow, that's so cool. I don't know why I thought it was so cool. I just thought that's so cool.
Well, I wish that the shows tried to capture that feeling, because there was something really magnificent about those Blish covers. The sense of, epicness and there was an artistry to it that was just beautiful. I mean, even the more cheesecakey stuff like Mudd's Angels, that's awesome. It was
what? I think they captured what we thought of Star Trek, like in our mind's eye. It was much more epic in our imaginations than even the show would show us. And those covers made Star Trek awesome. Yeah. Not that it wasn't already awesome, but because they were like riffs. You could tell it was Star Trek, but it was like grander and bolder and more sci-fi.
It was the promise of Star Trek.
Yes.
I think it's so hard to convey what these books, just like Splinter of the Mind's Eye was for us as Star Wars fans, meant that, the adventure was not over. Because when Splinter of the Mind's Eye came out, there was no guarantee that Empire was still going to going to happen. And with the Star Trek, it was very unlikely, despite, attempts to get a Star Trek movie going, that Star Trek would ever come back. So, to quote a great visionary on Nimbus 3, it's all that we had.
It's like the best metaphor to me is they were like a drug, right? Like we were addicted to this thing called Star Trek. And for me, when the pocketbooks started coming out, I would run to whatever store carried books, because they would always have the latest Star Trek paperback.
Right.
I would run to see if there was a new one. I would always get them. I would always buy them. I mean, unlike Rob, I sort of knew in my head that they weren't the show, but I did not care, because they were perfectly valid adventures and maybe they could have happened. And like,
that's how I thought about it too.
Different. Right. It's like, and so many amazing things happened in the context of those books. So many things that we got out of it that maybe we don't even think about now. And I feel like, in a weird way, I feel like this is a 4:30 movie, and I don't want to rush ahead to things that are on our list. But we learn things about the Klingons that we never knew. We learn things about the Romulans that we never knew. We learn things about our main characters that we never knew, like their fucking first names. You know what I mean? Like, just all kinds of things emerged from these books that still today we kind of feel them. It's like, tell me that, yesterday's child didn't actually happen. You know what I mean? Or look at the number of those writers who became writers on the shows.
Mm-hmm.
Like Melinda Snodgrass.
Yeah, I mean, she wrote The Tears of the Singers, which is a great horror novel.
Alfie Singer.
But also,
Alfie Singer?
What's I think really important about the books is it was the people that were writing them a lot of them were legitimate, like Joe Haldeman and David Gerrold were legitimate science fiction novelists in their own right. And world building was a big part of it. And I think, to me, the very best of the Star Trek novels, the reason look, there was too many sequels to too many episodes.
Right.
But when somebody went in, and we'll talk about it later because there's one of these books on the list, the world building that a lot of the best of the Trek authors did, they extrapolated, and they're like, okay, in this episode, if A and B were true, that would mean that C, D, E, F, G, H, I were also true. Because they were extrapolating on how did things work in the Star Trek universe. Like, as an example, I'm just pulling this out of my ass, it's not from a book. But like the M5 computer, the duotronic circuit that Richard Daystrom, it was called the M5. So there had to have been an M1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
Right. So somebody would go back and the authors would research what computer advancement was like in the 60s or the 70s or whatever. And then they would extrapolate that into the future. And so the best of the Star Trek novels gave you it was a world building exercise to the Star Trek universe. And for the best books, it felt extraordinarily legitimate.
And the name of that novel is called Not Entirely Successful.
Well, but
I thought it was called Boy Genius.
One of the things that really began to frustrate me with the advent of the Next Generation, not to slam Next Generation, but there was less thought and world building put into the actual series episodes that had been put into a lot of the novels up to that point. Because Next Generation started in 1987, where we had the 66, 67, 67, 68 seasons. So you're 20 years on, and I would have thought that anybody who worked on Star Trek would have had they had to have my working knowledge of the Star Trek universe, which part of it came from these novels. And it was very apparent to me with Next Generation that no, they didn't.
Do you feel there was a law of diminishing returns, that the original series had better and more thoughtful stories than ultimately a lot of the next gen books and later, Deep Space Nine and Enterprise and Discovery, et cetera?
No, but they were more controlled because of what happened to Star Trek novels in the 80s, where they just went off the deep end in a pretty interesting way with things like Barbara Hambly's Ishmael, which is Here Come the Brides in Space, or the weird kind of slash fiction
with Paladin
universe, the Killing Time by Della Van Hise, or the crazy Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbraith books with like Omni, The Price and Fate of the Phoenix,
from the
and
70s.
Triangle, which I don't even know what happened in Triangle, and I've read it like 4 times. And it was like we had these kinds of books, and the 80s was this crazy time in Star Trek because everyone thought, I'm going to do a romance in the Star Trek universe, or I'm going to bring slash fiction legitimate. And it was such a weird time. So when you bought those Pocket books, and when Pocket took over, the first book they released was, of course, the Star Trek the Motion Picture novelization, which I hope it's on this list, is one of the craziest Star Trek novels ever, because it was the only Star Trek novel actually written by Gene Roddenberry, and there's a lot of Roddenberry in that book.
If the 70s was the Wild West, then the 80s was the Gold Rush.
Yeah, with a lot of cocaine.
Yes.
Right.
Well, they had tight deadlines, so it's understandable. I got to tell you,
warp, warp, do the yayo.
It's interesting because a lot of us discovered some of these books in school or in school libraries or in libraries. I was at my son's parent-teacher conference, and as I was leaving his English class, I saw a little book thing, and they had a Babylon 5 novel on the spinner, and I'm like, I just had I couldn't believe it. I'm like, this is so weird. I'm like, you don't expect to find that in a high school. And if I thought anything, it would be a Star Trek novel, but it was like they had a Babylon 5 novel, and I'm like, whoa, that's a deep cut.
I weep for the future. What?
No, it's like, yes, we're reading War and Peace of Mice and Men and Captain Sheridan's Holiday. So I don't know. But anyway.
You should do a Glorious Babylonians podcast on Babylon 5.
Maybe? No.
I mean, I like Babylon 5 quite a bit, but I don't have a lot
tribute
to share
to sound
about
design.
it.
But we don't have 5 years of weekly things to talk about Babylon 5.
It's true.
I mean, I look. Obviously, we could do more Babylon 5 episodes because the Blu-ray's coming out this month. It's been a long time coming, so I'm anxious to see that. I haven't watched the animated film yet. I'm looking forward to that. Have you watched the
I have. I have the 4K disc.
How is it?
I liked it. It kind of falls into this weird. I don't know why everyone's trying to make multiverse stuff, but it does fall into that sort of thing. But
it's nice that they were able to weave Mr. Eriks into it.
Yeah, I want to be excited about that because Studio Mir was the animation house behind that. It wasn't my team, but my team did Journey to the Dark End for Star Wars Visions. But I feel like just to support my people, I should be watching the animated Babylon 5.
You should. It's enjoyable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I want to watch it. I mean, I always admire the imagination of that. I mean, Rob, you and I used to watch those episodes every week together.
Okay.
It's true, we did. And
that was back when we were doing Free Enterprise.
What's really interesting is, I look at season 3 and season 4, at least half of season 4 is some of the greatest science fiction TV ever. And the characters, I mean, it's unfortunate that Straczynski never knew from season to season whether he was going to get picked up. But
yeah, absolutely.
I went back, and when they were on HBO, I was going back and watching them, and I was surprised at how enjoyable. Again, obviously the visual effects are very hard to watch, but what's really interesting is because no other show looks like that.
Yeah,
you kind of get used to those effects, and you kind of come to love them again.
I really enjoyed watching. I skipped a bunch of the lousy standalones, but I watched some of the better episodes, and I found it very gratifying. It still was quite enjoyable, quite imaginative and interesting, and I really enjoyed it. For those of you at home who are curious, Rob and I, when we were doing Free Enterprise, we would watch Babylon 5 or Deep Space Nine. We'd work and then procrastinate, and then go to In-N-Out Burger around midnight. Because it was the only time there was no line at the drive-thru. Actually, there usually was. Then we'd have In-N-Out, and then we'd work for another couple hours.
Or we'd go to Jerry's. Rest in peace. Jerry's Deli. Oh.
Yeah, sad. Okay, well, this brings us to our top 10 Trek fiction books. And we'll be getting to nonfiction this episode as well, but we're going to start, and that's a whole nother thing, but we'll talk about it when we get to it. Let's start with number 10 and Ashley Miller.
So, starting at number 10 is, on some level, the books that started it all, and we've talked about them a little bit already. But the James Blish Star Trek novelizations, which were exactly what they sound like. It was Blish taking scripts, having not seen episodes, and writing novelizations of those scripts. From all reports, Blish was not a fan of writing tie-in novels, but he was a fan of money. And who isn't? But those novelizations were, I think, the beginning of what we were talking about in terms of the thing that keeps the show alive and keeps interest alive, and I think helped to demonstrate to the powers that be that there was a strong fandom for Star Trek that was out there, even after the show itself was gone. Obviously, Gene Roddenberry's convention tour helped a lot with that as well. But it's interesting to kind of go back and look at those books and see how what happens when you start adapting from a script without having seen the episode. What that looks like. It's almost there's sort of an archaeological dig factor to it, where you're saying, oh, okay, that's a road we didn't expect them to have taken, or there was a scene that I didn't see, and you see this sometimes in other tie-in novelizations where there's a scene in the script that makes it into the book, and you don't know where the hell that came from. But now you can see it with all of those books, and I believe that was Mud's Angels was I Mud and Mud's Women together, right? Those were those two novelizations kind of taken in one,
and with an original story, and it's and the animated episode,
right.
Mud's Passion.
Mud, yeah,
that's right.
Mud's had a lot of stuff, right?
It's a lot of mud.
It's a lot of mud. It's a whole lot of mud. Got a whole lot of mud. There you go. All right, I stopped the show, guys. Okay, he's great.
I know, because you did James Blish 1 through 9, so now we're at number 1. No, I'm kidding. But and we've talked about this. What's interesting is they were based on the scripts, so there are a lot of scenes that you'll never see in an episode, which I think was hard to fathom. Is when we were reading them, when we were younger, it's like what is all this?
Yeah, this isn't how it went.
They're not particularly well written. But
it's like Kirk and Court Martial, but that's not the way it happened.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And titles like The Unreal McCoy.
Right.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting is this was a time before home video. So the fact just that, could you imagine, novelizations of every episode of NCIS? I just just the very fact that
that's more like
novelized they novelized every episode of the series.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy that exists. And even though the original books are hard to come by, I know Barnes & Noble did a very nice collection. I think I first got it in the Star Trek Reader, which was a compilation of multiple episodes. But Barnes & Noble a couple of years ago, they do these hardcover special editions, and they did a collection of the Star Trek James Blish novelizations. It's quite a nice way to collect it.
Yeah. They were fun. I mean, when you're a kid, I listened to my dad read them to me, when I was 5 and 6 years old. I'll tell you a funny story. I didn't have all of them. And when I would find one at the local drugstore, Lakeside Drugs, Mercer Island, I would go up there. They were like 75 cents. And I would buy them. And one day I came home and all the rest of the ones that had been published up through 10 were in my bookshelf. My mom had seen that I was buying with my allowance, and she went down and found the numbers 11 and 12, and Mud's Angels hadn't come out yet. And my mom bought them for me. And
she didn't nice.
She didn't say a word. She just put them in my bookshelf. And it was one of those moments where you're like, wow.
My mom's cool. That's awesome. Way to go, Nancy Burnett.
I know, right?
Yeah, I like that. That's impressive. That's a really nice story, Rob.
You like that? It's a true story.
Yeah. Maybe it was Santa.
No, it was like at the end of the. No, I think it was in the summer, because that's what I was able to.
Then it wasn't Santa.
Summer Santa.
Yeah.
Must not be Santa. Okay. That brings us to number 9, and Robert Meyer Burnett. What's number 9 on our list of top 10 Star Trek fiction?
Well, number 9, I would call this Peter David, obviously a comic writer par excellence. I mean, anyone who's read his Hulk run has fond memories of it. He started writing Star Trek fiction, and he wrote a lot of amazing tie-in stuff. Like his novel Vendetta basically postulated that the Doomsday Machine was originally built to fight the Borg, and that was very cool. And when Pocket started publishing hardcover Star Trek novels, they went to him, and one of the books he published, which I think is probably his best remembered, was Imzadi. And Imzadi is a Riker Troy story. And at the time, I'll be honest, in Next Generation, Riker and Troy were not exactly my favorite characters, because I thought they were underdeveloped on the show. Peter David did a really good job delving into, he took everything that I love. There's a future history story where Riker was the Enterprise F before there was an Enterprise F, and there was a horrible, it was kind of like, it felt like some of it was mined for all good things. I don't know. Where Deanna had died and Riker was a bitter old man. His career went into a dead end, and they had to go through the Guardian of Forever, and they had to change time. And it was a very satisfying read. it might be too fan fiction-y for me now. But I remember at the time, I felt real pathos and emotion in that book, and I really liked it. And to give a shout out, which I've never really understood why they never did this, Peter David went on and created an ongoing series called Star Trek New Frontier, where he took some Next Generation characters and some original characters, and he wrote an ongoing series. It was basically a new Star Trek series about Captain
Which is
Mackenzie.
basically what IDW is doing now with Defiant.
Right, exactly. And the Captain Mackenzie Calhoun. And Mackenzie, there's an action figure of Mackenzie Calhoun. There's all kinds of things. And it was shout out to Peter David. And then those series, and those were both in paperback and hardcover, crossed over throughout Star Trek fan fiction for a long time. And I always thought to myself, well, if you're going to make a new Star Trek series, why not just adapt that? You know, they've never, one of the, I think, frustrating things for anybody who reads tie-in fiction, whether it's the like Aliens versus Predator comic series or the Dark Empire comic series, they never go back and look at these beautifully constructed and written novels or comics that people who really knew the source material would write. And something like New Frontier would have made a great series. Yeah. Great characters.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Interesting. And, you know, Peter was ubiquitous and obviously wrote so many books and loved Star Trek so much. And he's had his ups and downs health-wise lately, and we wish him well. He's definitely been a major contributor to Star Trek over the years.
Well, I certainly met you the day we met him.
Yeah, that's right. When we were screening, or you were screening, and we were promoting the screening of Oblivion, George Takei at the San Diego Comic-Con.
I've never seen a man do a reading of his comic books to a full theater of people.
With such panache.
That was amazing.
Well, because the buses didn't show up, and so he had to stall. And he did a really good job stalling by reading his own work while we were hanging out at, do you remember where?
A bar?
No, not so cool as that. We were hanging out at Chuck E. Cheese.
Oh, that's right.
Wow.
Because that was the only place that was close to the theater that was open.
Yeah.
And we were waiting for the buses to show up with the people. And so you and me and Parker and a bunch of other people were hanging out at Chuck E. Cheese, waiting for the screening of Oblivion to begin. We went to a bar after the screening, but before that, it was all about Chuck E. Cheese, Five-Fingered Freddy or whatever the hell that thing is.
Five Nights.
Five Nights at Freddy's. This is one night at Chuck E. Cheese.
Getting fingered by Freddy for 5 nights.
Easy.
And it's interesting because obviously Amzadi still resonates for people because I see John and Marina signing that book a lot for fans.
Yeah, well, there's a great cover painting. That was another thing. The pocket books had Boris Vallejo or Keith Birdsong did beautiful covers for those things. And they did an Amzadi too, but it wasn't as good.
You know what somebody should do? They should do a hardcover coffee table collection of the artwork of the Star Trek novels. Because
I think that would be amazing.
Yeah, there's so much beautiful artwork from the Bantam days through Pocket, Timescape, Pocket, Simon & Schuster, Titan. I mean, there's a lot of beautiful artwork.
Let's get on the phone and make it happen.
Yeah.
Oh, let's get on that. Get on the phone and get some of those
get on the
fancy heaters
blower
in
and
our way.
Glorious Trexperts present
I'm sure
some shit
somebody
other people did.
Somebody who controls marketing would say no one's going to buy that. They wouldn't let you do it.
Yeah, well.
They're wrong, by the way.
Well, screw them.
They're 100% wrong. 100% wrong. I would buy some posters of those books too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, it's like when we first met and you had the idea for Pike's Place Orion Slaveware,
which we actually did. The Star Trek fan club was selling it. No one bought our product.
It was ahead of
They
its
were
time.
right when they said no one will buy it.
It's going to be just like Kid Cudi's apparel line.
Yeah, no. At the time, we thought they loved it. They loved it.
Uh-huh.
It was gorgeous, but it was too hip. You had a picture of William Wyndham with this anguished expression going.
It just said
there was, but not anymore.
That was it. That's all it was. And we wanted Star Trek apparel you could wear to a club.
Yeah,
that was the whole idea.
And you had the Green Orion slave girl that had Pike's Place.
And then we had just the like graphic circle and the phaser, classic phaser, and it just said Type 2.
Yeah,
that's it.
Right. That's right.
I mean, you know what's funny? I found our ad sheet for that not too long ago.
Oh, you should put that up. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, and then we did do our logo shirt with it was called our show. Our Star Trek clothing line was called Pike's Place Orion Slavewear.
Yeah,
and it was and it was Unleash the Green Animal Woman in You.
Oh my God!
And it was Vina. And we had the big graphic design. And by the way, that all got approved because it was a different time. The Star Trek fan club,
and it was cool.
Yeah, no one bought it.
And Dan Madsen loved it.
He did love it. He was the only one.
He was a big booster.
I remember him telling me, like, reluctantly, he's like, "Yeah, no one's buying your clothes." And I'm like, if you can't. And then I realized Star Trek fans are not, maybe necessarily not all Star Trek fans are the kind of fans I am.
Well, they want shirts that have
that
picture of Patrick Stewart on them that say Picard, right? Or make it so,
In case you don't know.
Yeah.
So
now I think you could get away with something like that.
I think you could do something cooler.
We
tried to do a few styles of T-shirts for the Ticonderoga tour, and one of them had a famous shot of Shatner as Kirk, and it says, "Come see me in my cabin sometime."
Oh, nice.
Oh, that's good.
Why don't you just get a picture of Shatner in the motion picture saying, "Won't you please sit down?" I'd get that.
That's a good one, too. Especially when you got to get the frame where he's going.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Or I stand corrected.
Right.
Infinite possibilities. Yes, it is.
Infinite. Okay, so let's get back to the books.
Right.
And not the T-shirt line.
Top 10 T-shirts of Star Trek.
So now that was Imzadi at number 9. Now we're up to number 8. Darren, tell us what our 8th best Star Trek book is.
Number 8 is actually a series of 3 books. Only 2 of them are really good, in my opinion. The third one is sort of a hit or miss, but it is perhaps the most fan-wankiest series of books ever made.
Fan-wankiest. That's a new word. I like that word.
That's a good thing for me in this instance. It is Greg Cox's series, the Eugenics Wars, the Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh. Yes.
Okay, great.
That other one I'm doing for number 6.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay. Keep going. We're riveted.
It is a wonderful tale, starting with Khan at age, I believe, 10, and it follows through to his launch at the end. It is wonderfully sprinkled with all sorts of references, all sorts of characters, all sorts of ideas sprinkled from the original series and later, and even in Deep Space Nine. It is an amazing collection of references that are melded together. And one of the great surprises happens, I think, early in the first book, where we realize that the project that created Khan and his brothers and sisters is being watched very closely by Gary Seven and Roberta Lincoln.
Yep.
It is amazing. There is an adventure where they have to infiltrate the secret lab where these children have been created. And it's really fun because not only do you get an adventure with young Khan, but you get a Gary Seven adventure, which we've always wanted. And the ability that Greg has to make this absolutely real and fun is amazing. And I enjoy it so much. That's just the first book. The second book gets into even more references and creative weaving. You were going to say something, Rob.
I was going to say, though, that I, too, enjoyed the fan wank of this book. I liked all 3 of them. But it did start a trend in Star Trek that I couldn't stand to this day that is still being, Strange New Worlds has weighed into this even today, which is they're trying to reconcile our actual past,
right,
with Star Trek's actual past,
right,
which I have never understood. It was always, even as a little kid, you know, like when you're watching Assignment Earth, there was no nuclear weapons platform, and there was none. Star Trek's past is not our past. There was, I mean, we didn't know it at the time, but there was no eugenics wars. So in this book, they wanted to like figure out, well, how come we didn't have the eugenics wars? And I'm like,
right.
I never thought that Star Trek's past, because you find out that Captain Christopher went on a mission to Saturn in Tomorrow Is Yesterday, and it's like, well, how would you know that if it's in the future? I mean, it never, there was no indication that our past, I mean, sure, a lot of things were the same, like in From the Earth for All Mankind, which they do a great job, but it wasn't our past. And they keep trying to make our past Star Trek's past, which
because if our past isn't Star Trek's past, then Star Trek will not happen for us. That's the reason. Is because we need a connection to that wonderful world which we want to be in. And if it doesn't exist, then we're all out of luck.
See, and that's why you should just ignore it. Because to quote David Mamet, backstory is bullshit. Right? Meanwhile, I mean, the books are basically like, let me kind of sum up. It sort of sounds like the Catcher in the Rye meets James Joyce's Ulysses, but what if Kurt Vonnegut got really high and decided to write a Star Trek novel?
But the thing
that kind of it, like listen, continuity and signals to come unstuck in time.
Because in 2019, replicants were running around Los Angeles. We just didn't know.
That's in the rain, by the way.
It just didn't make. I mean, Star Trek was telling the story in the 23rd century, which hadn't happened yet. Right. So the idea that our past was supposed to tie into a fictional future didn't make any sense to me. It still doesn't to this day. But I understand what you were saying, and that's the rationale they always give us.
Yeah.
You heard what Akiva Goldsman was talking about this with the second season of Strange New Worlds.
What he says is untrue, and I do not hear his words.
Well, it's just a dumb. Look, I prefer, since you brought up Blade Runner, when they made Blade Runner 2049, they had to take into consideration when Blade Runner came out in 82, well, they didn't have the kind of amazing technology we have today. So they had to make a decision when they made the sequel. They had to say, okay, the world that was depicted in Blade Runner is essentially analog. They just never developed the kind of technology that we have in our world. So they went with the technology that the original film established, which I think gave the movie a lot more credibility. You saw those data balls that are made of wood coming down and things like that. It was just that much more interesting.
Well, that's just from the Minority Report.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, that was the Eugenics Wars, a very clever look at how the Eugenics Wars happened in the 90s, and we weren't aware of it. A trilogy of books by Greg Cox, very, very intelligent, kind of interesting way of threading the needle. And then that brings us to number 7 and Robert Meyer Burnett.
Well, okay. Now, I make no secret of the fact that Judith and Garfield and Reeve Stevens are two of my favorite, as a husband and wife team, my favorite Star Trek novelists. They're just fantastic. They know so much about Star Trek. They were later producers on Enterprise, writer-producers on Enterprise, and they teamed up. Believe it or not, I mean, you couldn't, if someone told me this was going to happen, I would have said, you're out of your mind. But it did happen. And they teamed up with no less than William Shatner himself to write 10 Star Trek novels, 10 hardcover Star Trek novels together. Now, they're I would say for the most part, they're pretty great. The last 3, kind of run out of steam, although they did make me a character in Captain's Blood. But the incredible book, The Ashes of Eden, was a great story that Shatner, you had a great Starfleet commander who had gone off the rails, and there was a lot of Star Trek tropes, but it was a story where it examined Kirk in his older years. And I think it's a wonderful classic Star Trek tale that is a frothy mix. And, I asked both Bill and I asked the Reeve Stevens, I was like, come on, how much of this stuff did Shatner really come up with? And the Reeve Stevens were very candid. And they said, Bill comes up with these ideas. And the ideas, the premises of these shows or the books are pretty interesting. And then, of course, the Reeve Stevens who knows Star Trek come in and make it all work. But, it's
I think he also talks about things that are going on in his own life.
Yes.
And how he can apply those things to Kirk.
Yeah,
and that was
100%. And, you go back and you read the original story treatment for Star Trek V. It's pretty interesting. Like, it's not bad.
Yeah.
And I didn't think it was bad. And I think that, first of all, the Reeve Stevens, they know their Star Trek, and every sentence has something that is world building or extrapolating out from the Star Trek universe. And the reason he picked them in a very shrewd move, because Shatner's a great businessman, he was like, who are the best Star Trek novelists? And I'm going to work with them. And we'll talk about them later. But the Reeve Stevens wrote what I would consider to be two of the finest Star Trek novels ever written. And they worked together for 10 books. 10 books. And each, they basically did trilogies. And this trilogy, Ashes of Eden, is the first of the Odyssey trilogy that has The Return as book 2, which you've seen in the Otoy adaptation where Spock finds or goes to Veridian 3 to Kirk's gravesite. And the Shatner books have kind of become, in a weird way, more than beta canon. They've become adjacent canon, if you could call it that. Really, really interesting stuff. But the Ashes of Eden, it was also adapted into a DC comic. So either way, it's fantastic. But the book,
and I want to just stop and say the DC comic I thought was excellent. I thought that was a beautiful adaptation of the book.
It was really great. And then Chris Claremont's Debt of Honor. We weren't talking about comics, but that's a great Star Trek comic too.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a whole nother list.
Yeah,
we're not going to go there. I was just saying that Ashes of Eden was a good adaptation.
It was a very good adaptation.
And then of course he did many sequels, including The Return, which he tried to convince Rick Berman to do as a film.
They should have
done Ashes of Eden as a movie.
Yeah, they should have done Ashes of Eden as a movie. It would have, the whole thing, the whole Preserver or the whole Odyssey trilogy would have been great. I mean, I always thought it was funny because, like in Preserver, you're talking about the preservers, like the asteroid obelisk from the Paradise Syndrome is on the cover, and I'm like, Shatner doesn't know what that is.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I thought it was very funny because for Thanksgiving we ran on social a picture of Kirok and Miramani. Happy Thanksgiving.
Right.
And most people got the joke and thought it was clever. There are a couple of people like, this is in such bad taste. This is so tasteless. How could you do this? This is not it's like, and then somebody said, how many indigenous actors worked on that episode? It's like, fucking none. It was 1969. That's not how we thought back then.
Yeah.
It's don't apply your contemporary perspective to, it's like, come on. We never watch anything that was made before, last year.
Well, that's what some people would like.
Yeah. They'd be missing out on a lot of great movies and television.
It's like, true.
Oh my God. And so like 99% of people just thought it was, very fun, which it was. It was a gorgeous picture.
Because it's fun. It's silly.
It's
supposed to be
exactly.
silly.
It's supposed to be silly, but some of the people are humorless. And it's just like, I love the virtue signaling. And this is coming from a super liberal. I'm like, and I'm just like, the fucking virtue signaling is like ridiculous. Well, I think it's very inappropriate that on Thanksgiving, the Inglorious Trexpert would post this. Do they realize? It's like, yeah, we know what we're doing. God damn.
You mean that wasn't the first Thanksgiving with William Shatner?
Yeah.
Plus, Miramani's.
Yeah, Sabrina Sharf. Yeah.
Stuff her turkey.
Hey, easy.
It was just.
I mean, what are they expecting? Star Trek to do Killers of the Flower Moon? But even that wasn't enough. It's like, oh, well, Martin Scorsese directed it. It should have been. It's like, you want this to get made? You want someone to see it?
Killers of the Flower Moon needed someone to say, "Behold a god who bleeds."
I like Killers of the Flower Moon, by the way.
I did too.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that was number 7, The Ashes of Eden. a terrific book from William Shatner. I would say William Shatner and friends. William Shatner and Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens. Darren is shaking his head. I think we have a contrary opinion here.
No, it's fine. It's fine. But the number 6 is something that I'm excited about.
Okay.
Ashes of
Darren
Eden.
Not excited about Ashes of
Eden.
Eden, but fortunately we have Darren here to tell us about a book he is excited about at number 6.
Okay. Preface. I am excited about this book, but it's not great. It's just a fun idea. And it is
damning it with faint praise.
It is no. It is Vonda McIntyre's Enterprise, the First Adventure. Now, the idea behind this is great. What would Captain Kirk's first mission be as soon as he takes over the Enterprise as captain? And there it becomes rather silly because they get involved. It's sort of a combination of the Shakespeare episode and something else. But anyway, the Enterprise comes in contact with this. Okay, there's no better word for it. It's a space circus. And they volunteer to take this circus to a faraway planet where they're supposed to give shows, and it's all very magical. They get involved with one of the members of the circus is the first passionate Vulcan, and he is his name is Stephen, and whether he is a cousin of Spock or a farther relation of Spock, he's related to Spock somehow. And his family has looked down on him with disdain because he openly shows emotion left and right, and he's quite embarrassing for fellow Vulcans. But it's interesting because it's very much in parallel with Sybok. And the creation of that character is very similar to the setup that is in Enterprise, the First Adventure. It does give Kirk a bit of a love interest, and it's a rip-roaring adventure where they try to fit the entire circus group into the shuttle bay deck, and they give lessons to juggling and all sorts of things. It's fascinating.
Was Hazel Honeysuckle on board?
She was not. She was very, very young at the time.
Okay.
But yeah, that would have been fascinating. Look, it's silly, but it is fun to read, and it is interesting to see how Vonda McIntyre treats these characters who have just met each other. And it's it isn't governed by the idea that they all went to Starfleet Academy together or things like that. That's I think that's a bit of more contrived than this story is. But it's wholly entertaining. You can hear the actors saying their lines. It sounds like an original series show, and I found it very entertaining.
My favorite scene is where Roger Moore dresses up as a clown. Yes. Like that was really cool at the circus. Yeah. But yeah, what do you guys think of Enterprise, the First Adventure?
Actually, we can't hear you.
Oh, stupid microphone.
There you go.
I love this book. It makes me happy.
Yeah.
When I read it, it made me super happy. It made me happy in the pants. It felt like, like I was, it had like the kind of energy that I associate with the original series.
Yeah.
Right. I didn't get bogged down in anything. It was clever. It's like I'm a Vonda McIntyre fan.
Yeah.
And I just love the way that she writes those characters from the inside out. And they could be doing almost anything, and it is entertaining. So I just dig on this book, and it's absolutely one of my favorite Star Trek novels of all time.
Rob, wasn't this an interesting era of Star Trek? You alluded to it earlier. This was really the heyday because you had these supersized.
This was a giant-sized novel.
So along with the hardcover books, Simon Schuster was really doubling down on the success of Star Trek paperbacks by introducing these two new lines of books, the hardcovers and then the supersized books.
Yeah. And the thing is, there was a credibility that this novel series had. They were, and Vonda McIntyre, really after the novelization of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, she wrote the first of this modern era of Star Trek novels in The Entropy Effect. And The Entropy Effect had a great villain, Georges Mordreau. And then it did things like it put Sulu front and center. And I remember there was these starship combat simulators, and Sulu, like at the Academy, was using, and in it, he was able to tumble like starships around because he used gravity and inertia. And I was like, wow, because we'd always thought of starship combat on the space lake, ships. They never used the X, Y, and Z axis. They was always the space lake and
two-dimensional thinking.
Two-dimensional thinking. And Vonda McIntyre was the first person that blew my mind when she took starship combat, at least in Star Trek, into the third dimension with Sulu. And coming back, and again, these books, these were people that were world building eras that we hadn't seen before. And it felt legitimate because they didn't just take, they used 10,000 different things and were able to distill them. And it felt authentic.
And they found it a challenge and a joy to tie it in with everything else.
Yes. And you could tell that they had painstakingly researched all of this stuff. They'd gone through the entire series with a fine-tooth comb. So that was that. And so for me, as a big fan, to read this stuff, because they were staying away. And by the way, I don't know if this came out pre-Next Generation. I'm not sure. I'd have to look.
No, I think it was after Next Generation.
Okay, it might have been after Next Generation.
Sure.
But it was really interesting because they really tried hard to incorporate all of this stuff. And I think that, to me, Vonda McIntyre was one of the giants of Star Trek. Obviously, they tapped her to write the novelization for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And
I take it back. It was the year before Next Generation.
Okay. Yeah. So this was before Next Generation threw a whole monkey in the wrench in terms of the timeline. The encounter at Farpoint suddenly said that Earth had World War III.
Right.
And then it's like, wait, what? There was the eugenics wars. There's a World War III. And oh, yes, there was the post-atomic horror. Sure. And it's like, well.
So, Ashley, do you think that the one thing that JJ's 2009 movie was missing was a circus?
You know what? What movie is not missing a circus? Right? I mean, circuses can be creepy. Circuses can be funny. Circuses can be romantic. By God, bring on the circus. And the bread. Bring on the bread and the circuses.
Yeah. But maybe they missed, they're missing the elephant acts. Okay. Well, I'm glad this is a book that looms large for a lot of people. Simon & Schuster made it a big event with their supersized, the release of Vonda McIntyre was a Trek legend at that point, having kicked off the Timescape line with The Entropy Effect, the first pocket fiction book not based on a movie. And that brings us now to our top 5. And Robert Meyer Burnett, who's going to tell us what our 5th pick for the top Star Trek fiction is.
Well, so I for my favorite Star Trek authors, I do break it into the 80s, the 90s, and the 21st century. And for me, the 80s was dominated by Diane Duane, who wrote like The Wounded Sky and My Enemy, My Ally, and she coined the phrase, Romulans didn't call themselves Romulans. We called them Romulans. They called themselves the Rihansu, which I thought was a really cool word. And so she was the end all be all of my Star Trek fiction in the 80s. The 90s was definitely the Reeve Stevens. Everything the Reeve Stevens did, I was on board with. They wrote nonfiction and fiction books. I was a huge Reeve Stevens fan. But the 21st century to me has been dominated. The 21st century started really the Star Trek Litverse, which was a continuity that took place post-Dominion War. And so they had all the interlocking books. Obviously Deep Space Nine and Voyager and other books would tie into this Litverse that had a very strict and very well curated continuity beyond the Dominion War, beyond the end of Deep Space Nine. And it was it was really fascinating to read, and all the authors that participated in that were great. But the one that I loved the most was David Mack. And David Mack, to me, took everything that I loved from my other favorite authors. The world building and the way he extrapolated the Star Trek universe was brilliant, and never so much as if you could I'll call a few of these books that we're going to talk about delicious. But the Mirror Universe, Mirror Mirror, second season original series episodes, one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek. And we'd seen it done. Now we've seen it done a lot in Deep Space Nine. We've seen it done in Discovery. In my estimation, it's never really been done that well. Nothing hit the heights of that one bottle episode in the Mirror Universe until David Mack wrote his Mirror Universe duology, which spans from the end of Mirror Mirror and what Spock does when the Mirror Kirk comes back to the ISS Enterprise, and how Spock teams up with Marlena Moreau basically to take over the Empire. And it goes on to the second book. So the first book is called The Sorrows of Empire. And the second book that takes place in the Next Generation era is called Rise Like Lions. And here was the Mirror Universe books that, if you're a Mirror Universe fan, this is the end all be all. These are the most well thought out, most interesting, just a beautiful, and we had the first arc in the original DC Star Trek comics about the Mirror Universe, but this was what I'd always wanted the Mirror Universe to be. And I dreamt of this so many times, I just didn't know what it was. And David Mack laid it out, and it was extrapolated upon shorter novellas he had written. And I'll tell you, this book, when I couldn't read Sorrows of Empire. By the way, Sorrows of Empire, what a great title. And it really summed up the whole thing. And God damn, did I love these books. And they didn't come out together. You had to wait. But I can't recommend them highly enough. And if you're a Mirror Universe fan, as I am, you'll weep for what they turned the Mirror Universe into in Discovery, which is unfortunate, because I wish somebody had read these books and they would have been like, oh, here's what we should do.
Yeah, it's interesting because, after Mirror Mirror, I don't love a lot of Mirror Universe stuff, but I do feel that even though crossover doesn't really work in Deep Space Nine, Shattered Mirror does. Yeah. There are a couple of good Deep Space Nine mirror stories.
But they didn't. And look, I do love the two-parter in Enterprise. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. But in terms of, I would much prefer like a historical examination of why the universe is the way it is, like what happened. What was the point of divergence that turned the Mirror Universe? And this is much more like it's more of an elevated story as opposed to just being a Trek tie-in. It could have worked. They work well if it wasn't even about Star Trek.
Sure.
So
no, that's great. And then you mentioned the great Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens, who wrote so many great novels, worked on Enterprise season 4. They are once again making our list at number 4. Ashley, tell us what we're reading at number 4, best Star Trek books.
So number 4 is it's one of my very favorite things. When you take chocolate and you mix it with peanut butter, what do you get? You get a Reese's peanut butter cup. When you take Captain Kirk and you mix him with Captain Picard, what do you get? You get the novel Federation. And not only is it a Reese's peanut butter cup, it's like the Reese's peanut butter cup with like other shit in it, because Zefram Cochrane is in this thing. And it's really just kind of a fascinating exploration of how the I don't want to say like how the West was won, because it's not quite the West, and there are like kind of space Nazis in it, but it's really about those days after First Contact with Zefram Cochrane, how he went from the end of First Contact straight up to Scott Mance's favorite episode of the original series. What happened there? It's got the Guardian of Forever. It's got Viridian 3. It's got so much stuff. It's bananas. But really, at the core of it is just it mixes the Next Generation and the original series and their attitude and their approaches in a way that makes them feel complementary. It makes it feel like there is actual growth, Not like because one thing is better than the other, but as though like a society, a culture, a way of looking at things has evolved from Zefram Cochrane's time to Kirk's time to Picard's time. It's a story about a series of men who are out of their own time, who are living in a world that isn't necessarily their own, and it's about the making of that world. And it's incredibly smart, and it's incredibly well written, and it's worth a read.
What's wild about this book is it came out on November 1st, 1994, which was the same month that Generations came out.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is this book is infinitely better than Generations. And this was one of the books that I was there the day this came out, probably had the whole thing read that day. And it does things like, it has Flint from Requiem for Methuselah as Micah Brack, a character named Micah Brack back who knew Zefram Cochrane.
Spoiler alert.
Sorry. This book is so great, and it turns into a very wild sci-fi plot as well. But it really takes you through Star Trek history. And it was and I will say it because, Mark, I saw Generations with you. We saw it on the Paramount lot. Yeah. And you were much more vociferous about your displeasure with the film as we were leaving the Paramount Theater.
Yes, I was.
But I found the movie tremendously disappointing because this book was infinitely more interesting and thoughtful and fascinating than Generations the movie was. I felt like I was watching, I was like, wow, how is it I just read this Star Trek novel that is 1,000 times better than the movie I just watched? And this has been my problem with a lot of being a Star Trek fiction fan. I've often thought that if anyone's going to work on a Star Trek show, we should give them a 25 book primer to read.
Or a 10 book primer.
Or a 10 book primer to read so they understand how to write Star Trek.
Yeah, that's interesting. And obviously this is a book that looms large. Again, another one of these. It was originally released in hardcover, right?
Yeah, it was a really prestigious hardcover with a great cover. And like you said, like Ashley pointed out, like Zefram Cochrane is a big character in this story. And then he shows up in the First Contact. You cannot tell me that this book did not have an influence on First Contact.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
I completely agree.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree because, obviously Ron read the books when he was younger. Like he talks about John Ford's The Final Reflection being a big influence on him and how he wrote the Klingons. But, I certainly don't think Brannon was familiar or reading any Star Trek fiction.
No.
And I just don't think at that point Ron was either.
You can't on one hand say that, oh, I wish they were reading these books. And then on the other side say, oh, well, obviously they were reading these books. Both can't be true.
I think it's more a matter of in the head canon, it feels like these things are of a piece and that they want to be. And that there's something that's cool about that.
But it's interesting how different recipes can be made from the same ingredients. And it's based on the qualifications of the chef.
Well, if anyone was reading these books at the time, it was Dave Rossi, who was Rick Berman's point person, and he would read for Rick to sign off from the Star Trek offices.
Yeah, this book even has references to. There's a new movement, which again they later used something similar in Enterprise, called the Optimum Movement, where there's a group of people trying to perfect the, they were trying to perfect the eugenics program that created Khan. And of course that thread was picked up by Deep Space Nine. So, yeah. No, a great book at number 4. It brings us to number 3. And earlier you alluded to some of the crazy books that have been part of Star Trek history. Ishmael, obviously Spock Messiah, Mac Reynolds' Mission to Horatius, all crazy off concept. What's so interesting about our pick for number 3 is it's all those things, but it's written by Star Trek's creator, Gene Roddenberry.
And of course, we're talking about the legendary novelization of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. This was a remarkable book because obviously, even though George Lucas was credited for Star Wars, it was known then and certainly now that it was Alan Dean Foster. You know, a lot of these books were credited to the creator or showrunner,
right?
But they were never actually written by them. Star Trek: The Motion Picture is actually written by Gene Roddenberry. And no story amuses me more than when he was warring with Harold Livingston over the various scripts of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Midway through production, the studio was clearly siding with Harold, and Gene drops in conversation, goes, "Oh, yes, hello, friend. I just got $400,000 to write the novelization of Star Trek: The Motion Picture." And it was like, and Harold was aghast. And at that point, Gene disappeared a little bit for the picture to busily write his novelization, which is cray-cray. There's stuff that, first of all, it opens, as those of you who listen to our wonderful episode on the Star Trek: The Motion Picture novelization know, and if you haven't listened to that first season episode of Inglorious Treksperts, you owe it to yourself to go back and listen to that magnificent episode featuring Darren reading excerpts from this book. But it's written, the introduction is from James Kirk, who talks about how Gene Roddenberry has chronicled his true life adventures and fucked it up.
Yeah,
as he told tall tales about what actually happened. And then we go into this book, and Captain Kirk is having psychological problems, and we learn about the new humans who are. Tell us a little bit about it, Darren.
Oh, I thought this was yours, but I will. It's great because it basically gives a lot of backstory as to what was going on Earth, and the new human movement, which none of the new humans were fit to be in space, however, because they couldn't handle it. They were so enjoying their life on Earth that they had become soft
of pleasuring and sexting.
It's basically the world of Logan's Run, whereas Kirk was.
It was the world of Gene Roddenberry's house in Bel Air.
That's right. But it's great because the opening scene, basically he gets a transmission from Starfleet of the Klingon attack sequence from Star Trek: The Motion Picture. That apparently the visual effects were done enough to transmit it to his brain, and it's a lot of fun, and it gives a little backstory. The footnotes are extremely fun to read throughout the novel because it mentions that the Enterprise was the only ship to come back from their 5-year missions intact. And so that is what made Starfleet take up the Arrowhead insignia from the Enterprise crew and give it to everyone in Starfleet. It's really magical, and it's fun to read these sort of different versions of scenes that we saw in the movie, and it definitely has that Roddenberry twist to it, where sex is always slightly underneath the surface.
It was fun to read in 1979. It's even more fun to read now.
Yeah.
Right, Rob? I mean, when you say,
oh, it is. I mean, you get to have an Admiral Dagora scene, and you get to hear who died on the transporter pad, and it's funny. I read this book before I saw the movie.
Yeah, me too.
And I still love the movie. I don't care.
And if you want a 3-page description of Persis Kambata in the solar shower, you get that too.
You're damn right you do.
It's true. I mean, but again, I think this book is most valuable for the insight you get about Gene Roddenberry himself.
Yeah.
And how he viewed the Star Trek universe.
This book was
Ashley,
Go ahead.
I want to ask you, did Elon Musk read this book when he came up with Neuralink? Because that's a big part of this. You no longer have communicators, that things are communicated directly into your head.
It's crazy. And there's the whole link between Spock and Kirk, and it's just and everything is just weird. But to me, the standout thing about this book was the description of what happens in the transporter accident that was so vivid that when I went to see the movie at the tender age of 6, I closed my eyes during that sequence because I expected to see what Roddenberry had described on the page. And thank God that's not what it was. But in my mind, that was it.
The Alien.
Yeah, exactly.
Another 1979 movie.
It's basically a scene from Arch Obler's radio play where someone is turned inside out.
Yes.
It's very fun.
Inside Out. Who sang that? The Pointer Sisters or was that Donna Summer? It was a disco song that was very popular at the time.
One of my...
I can sing it for you. I can't remember who sang it.
Yeah, okay.
The More You Turn Me.
Yeah, exactly. The More You Turn Me Inside Out.
One of my favorite footnotes is Captain Kirk basically addressing the idea of Kirk Spock / fiction.
Yep.
And saying that while he has nothing wrong with it, it never happened that way, but not that there's anything wrong with it.
Because Gene hated that people were doing the Kirk Spock / fiction.
Without
but
him.
He definitely wanted to say, no. Kirk Spock / fiction is
never
nonsense. Happened. There's nothing going on between Kirk and Spock. But there's nothing wrong with it, but just not for these two.
If there were, it would be fine.
It's funny because actually his opinion became a little more retrograde as the years went on, because in Next Generation, he was very reluctant to tackle those issues, which he was much more free to tackle in the 70s.
Right.
But it's a wonderful book. It's a book I go back to, which is sad because I probably read it more than The Great Gatsby. I read it more than actually.
One of the various
books.
copies that I have are the autographed version, which I cherish, and it's a beautiful edition.
Yeah, it's a really gonzo book, and I know a bunch of our listeners have gone back and read it after hearing about it on the show, and I don't think it's disappointed anybody for a myriad of reasons. So that's our pick. It's so unique, the fact that from the creator, because even you got to remember, Farpoint was written by DC, the novelization, but this was written by Gene himself, and anybody who tells you different. Guys, I don't think that Gene actually wrote it. I know you're the Treksperts, but my cousin told me it was really Alan D. No, it was Gene Roddenberry. And all you have to do is read it to know that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So now that brings us, we're almost at the end of our fiction list.
Can I just make one note that the actual novelization for Encounter of Farpoint was written by David Gerald?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Of course. It was David Gerald, not D.C. Fontana.
Yeah.
D.C. Fontana co-wrote the teleplay with Gene. And as she said, he wrote the envelope.
She did write a great Star Trek novel that they've ripped off a lot for Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
Well, I was going to ask you about that earlier, and I forgot to mention that. We talked about the influence of the novels on the shows. There's probably no more a better example of the novels making their way to the series than what you're about to talk about.
Well, yeah, the whole backstory of Rebecca Romijn, Una's character, and who and what she is. Of course, this is the thing that really kills me. Even in the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, in the end credits, they thank all of the creators of the various storylines that they touched upon in the movies that they're making. And it didn't used to bother me now, but now there's so much being drawn from the novels that's not accredited. Now, I understand there's Writers Guild rules and all that, but people like Dorothy Fontana have passed away. Yeah. And I mean, Ursula K. Le Guin, they basically lifted her story, Those Who Walk Away from Umlaas, for an episode of Strange New Worlds. And, if you think about the original series, when they found out that Arena bared a striking resemblance to Frederick Brown's short story, rather than deal with any kind of potential issues, they headed that off in the past.
They just paid him.
They paid him. And they credited him in the episode.
Yeah.
And I think it's really disheartening. And then when you see the producers of the show say, well, yeah, we're really influenced by Ursula K. Le Guin. I mean, what, you mean you took her story? Yeah. I think there's a difference by being influenced or actually lifting the tail and just changing a few things here and there. There's no reason why you can't do what Marvel does and thank the creators of whatever it is you're borrowing from. Now, I understand the legality of it is that Paramount owns all of it. If you write a Star Trek novel, it's work for hire. Whatever you put in that novel it is owned by them. But I think there's something to be said. Well, if you haven't seen this material that was made up for this novel and it makes its way into a teleplay,
Well, 100%. You just acknowledge it, just like they do with the comic book creators. A lot of it, for a while, the comic book creators weren't getting any additional money. They were getting acknowledgement. I'm sure they would have preferred money. But in this case, it would be, I think, just the right thing to do to acknowledge, the contribution, particularly when no one's questioning it. Nobody's saying, "Oh no, we didn't take it from there." They did take it from there. Obviously, it's just,
right.
So why not give credit where credit is due? It's inexpensive to give credit.
Well, I mean, we talked about the way the Guardian of Forever is portrayed in Discovery is right out of Harlan Ellison's original teleplay, and the comic book
definitely
adaptation.
got paid for.
And it was bad in Harlan's original teleplay. And anyway. But although that I think is that graphic novel is marvelous that the Tiptons adapted from Harlan's original script, and it's fascinating to read. I had read, obviously, Harlan had come out with a book about City
the
on
art's
Forever,
good too,
which had his original. The art's great. His original City on the Edge of Forever teleplay back in the 80s. I remember that book came out with his essay, basically lambasting the changes. And here's my original script. And I remember reading it and thinking, and reading Harlan's comments. I'm like, oh my God, Harlan really got screwed. Man, I can't believe it. It's a great episode, but they really ruined it. And then I read his thing and I'm like, oh.
Yeah, no.
It's great. Maybe it's not Star Trek.
But it's interesting that they decided to go with his version when they did it for Discovery.
It's interesting that anybody would go with that. A freaking guy in a top hat. I mean, come on. Right. I mean, it's like you want to tell that story, fine, but don't change the Guardian.
I think they did fine without having to watch the episode.
The funny thing about Guardian of Forever that's so interesting is this is the most beloved, iconic element of Star Trek in a sense, one of them. And it's been, how many times in books have they gone back to it? Even Gene tried to go back to it in his sequel to motion picture that never got made. And it finally, after Harlan passes away, because he's so litigious, they never touched it in the shows again, other than yesteryear.
Yeah.
That's what they do.
It's really odd. And then to make the Guardian of Forever a humanoid that's ambulatory, that can travel, it's Doctor Who. They made the Guardian of Forever Doctor Who. And I when I was watching that, I'm like, wait, what? And then the Guardian now has become a sage. Like, I'm going to send you back to participate in the story so you'll learn a lesson.
We've drifted way off course, gentlemen.
I'm sorry.
Good point, Darren. Well, that's funny because let's get back on course. Set the course for adventure. Out there that way brings us back to number 2. Robert, as we get closer to number 1, our number 1 top 10 Star Trek fiction, tell us what we find at number 2.
If anybody asks me, okay, I've never read a Star Trek novel, what Star Trek novel should I read? I give them this book. And once again, this was the Reeve Stevens had written a previous Star Trek novel, but this was a hardcover. By the way, I will say this, for a great book, this hardcover book has one of the worst covers I've ever seen. Just want to say. The paperback looks good, but the hardcover was just terrible. An embossed silver Enterprise, terrible. Prime Directive. This book, again, is, I talked to, when I met Bob Orsi, at Brandon Routh's wedding, because Brandon Routh had married Bob Orsi's sister.
Right.
And we were talking about Star Trek. I want to say this was before Star Trek 09 came out. And we were talking about, because he obviously couldn't tell me what Star Trek 09 was really about. But
I've seen it.
We were talking about this book, and Bob Orsi said this was his favorite Star Trek novel as well. And this book opens with a message talking about how all the different starships that were lost. And of course, one of them is the Enterprise.
Right.
And you're like, what? And Kirk is doing hard labor.
He's in captain's jail.
Yeah, he's in captain's jail. He's not at a prison camp. He's mining with Tellarites and all this stuff. And the Enterprise has been destroyed.
It's as if he'd filmed the Thunderbirds.
It was, and it was Kirk's fault, and a whole civilization was lost in a nuclear conflagration in a first contact mission, and things are bad.
The greatest opening scene of a novel ever.
I mean, you're like, oh my God, like what's going on? And then I don't want to ruin anything, but it goes from there. And the Reeve Stevens give everybody, all of our principal cast, all kinds of great stuff to do. This book it's hermetically sealed. You don't need to know a lot about the Star Trek universe. They wrote a book that's accessible to anybody who has a cursory understanding of the original series. It's a great science fiction novel. It's a great action adventure novel. It's a great Kirk story, and it's a great Star Trek story.
And it would be a perfect story to use the JJ cast in the final movie.
100%. If any Star Trek novel, and by the way, there's your fucking title.
Yeah.
Star Trek Prime Directive. And it immediately, imagine Chris Pine opens Chris Pine in this.
It'd be great.
Yeah, in a mining colony, zero gravity, whatever. I mean, this book is screaming to be adapted. And how many scripts have they written for Star Trek 4?
Because we don't hate the cast. We hate the stories.
Yeah. He doesn't hate the play. He hates the game.
The cast would devour this story. This is the perfect Star Trek story to adapt for a movie.
Yep.
Of course, they're going to hire someone else. I mean, I don't know how much money they have against Star Trek 4 in terms of directors they've hired, writers they've hired. I can't even imagine. It's insane. I offer you, Paramount Global, if you're not sold yet, I would say you should look at this book, and here is Star Trek 4 for you. Because Bob Orsi said to me, he said, we can't do Star Trek Prime Directive with the second movie because you have to know the cast more before you tell the story. And now we do.
Yeah.
I mean, this could be the greatest Star Trek movie ever made.
Totally.
Yeah. No, that is obviously one of the great Star Trek novels. The Reeve Stevens, are in the Hall of Fame of writing these novels. And it's a book that, is beloved and has stood the test of time. So that probably makes you think, what is our number one greatest Star Trek novel of all, Star Trek book of all time? But before we get to our number one Star Trek book of all time, it's time for honorary mentions. And I'm going to start with Ashley Edward Miller, what his honorary mentions. These are Star Trek books that didn't make the list, but could have.
So I had it in my heart that I was going to name Vonda McIntyre's The Entropy Effect, but we talked about that a little bit. So instead, my honorable mention...
kicked off Pocket's Timescape line. So it was a very significant book. It was a very significant book, but was it something that belonged in the top 10?
Maybe. Well, I mean, look, I think that it did. I think that to me, the honorable mention, my honorable mention would come from that Pocketbooks era. Entropy Effect certainly kicked off that era with aplomb.
I can't give it to a book that has Sulu and a mustache on the cover.
But
But
because we talked about it, the book I actually want to name as my honorable mention is The Final Reflection by John M. Ford. Not to be confused with, John Ford, but
or The Final Countdown.
Or The Final Countdown. But The Final Reflection is a book that takes place, it is about the Klingons, of the Klingons, and for the Klingons. And while later canon sort of moved away from things that Ford played around with in that book, some things did remain. There was this idea of the honorable kind of Klingon culture that is that's conveyed in The Final Reflection that kind of makes its way into the shows, into how we understand the Klingons now. And even sitting outside of canon the way that it does, it's worth a read. It's a really good book. It's fascinating, dare I say it. And I think it exemplifies why we all have such affection for the Pocket years of
the Bantam years.
Yeah.
And now that was a book that had a huge influence on Ron Moore. And how he wrote the Klingons. And he said that many times in interviews. And it's interesting. So you talk about these novels while they weren't canon, and yet they very much seeped into a lot of people's through osmosis, the way they wrote Star Trek, because so many fans, whether it be the Mike Sussmans of the world or Ron Moore or Robert Hugh Wolf, people who grew up on Star Trek, they were very much influenced by the stuff they read as kids and teenagers, as well as the classic sci-fi novels beyond Star Trek. Because in a way, I think that these were gateway drugs. At least for me, I started reading Star Trek novels, and then that got me into Asimov and Heinlein and all that. Okay, well, that's a great pick. John Ford's final reflection as an honorary mention for Ashley. What about you, Rob? What's your honorary mention?
My honorary mention is something that shouldn't work, but I loved it. It's a trilogy that I affectionately call Crisis in Infinite Star Trek Universes. So the Star Trek Litverse, the continuity that these writers had spent 20 years developing, was completely destroyed with Picard seasons 1 and 2 and Discovery and everything. So the Litverse, the Star Trek Litverse had become obsolete. 20 years of work by all these talented writers were swept away. But the writers, rather than just not make any more books, the writers led by David Mack, also Dayton Ward and James Swallow, pitched an idea to Pocket. Basically, we would like to end the Star Trek Litverse. And so they wrote this. Here's not only did they write this trilogy that is so gigantic, it's so ginormous in its scope. They decided the whole thing is they're going to fuck with everybody. The main character is Wesley Crusher. And the villains, the big bad that are if you read this book, you'll think to yourself, there's no way that they can make these. It's the villains from the 2-part Next Generation episode, Time's Arrow, the Davidians.
Not to be confused with the Branch Davidians.
I cannot believe, like, they make these villains so scary because they eat the living essence of people. So the Davidians are going and they're destroying the multiverse, all the different universes, just to eat the energy from living beings.
They get hungry.
They get hungry. Vol hungers. So do the Davidians.
They can eat.
And so these 3 books, Moments Asunder, The Ashes of Tomorrow, and Oblivion's Gate. Of course, they gave David Mack the end. Are so much fun if you've read all because these books have the continuity of the Litverse. So if you watch the shows, there's so much going on in these books that you might not understand because they're talking about 20 years of continuity. But for people that were reading these books, I couldn't get to the end of these fast enough. These books are so gonzo and so audacious. And so, like, whatever they thought, there's nothing too outlandish that they couldn't put in these books. And the fact that, Wesley is a traveler, and so there's multiple Wesleys in multiple universes, and it was very funny.
Oh my God. One universe.
Way too many Wesleys.
I knew
too many cooks.
I knew there was only one way that they could end this Litverse properly. And as soon as I opened the first page of the first book, I said, I know how they're going to end this. And they ended it exactly the way I thought they were going to end it, because there's only one way they can end it. And if this brings the Litverse to a close, any astute viewers of time travel or the multiverse will know where they're going. But I didn't care because it was awesome. And again, this is just throw everything into the kitchen sink, throw all the paint in the wall, call it what you want. Whether it's entirely successful, I don't care. I thought this thing was gonzo and crazy, and they just decided, let's just F with everybody because it doesn't matter. This is the end. This is the end of 20 years. These guys had been writing these carefully constructed continuities for 20 years, longer than any TV series had run. And they basically just said to them, sorry, doesn't matter. And they were able to get them to agree to let them make these 3 books. God bless them all.
It reminds me of that line from Shakespeare, kill all the Wesleys.
Yeah. There is certainly an element to that in these books.
Oh, that is so funny.
It's hilarious.
Great pick. And Rob, you talked about it, fascinating, on our first episode when we were talking about Time's Arrow. But and it was fascinating then. It's even more fascinating now to hear about this book and how it resolved the. I like the description of Crisis in Infinite Treks.
Yeah.
So, Darren, that brings us to you and your pick for honorary mention. This is a pick that could have made the list but didn't.
My pick for honorary mention is 12 books, actually. They're all in a set. And there's some debate in my mind whether or not they belong in fiction or nonfiction, honestly, because they are nonfiction representations of episodes. They are the photo novels. And we did a whole episode with the creator of the photo novels, and it was fascinating. And the backstory of him putting these together basically on a table is amazing. And I loved them from the moment I saw them. They were physical representations of these ephemeral episodes that I only had on audio tape. And it is so great to read them. And obviously, Scott Mance's favorite Metamorphosis is represented prominently in the set, and with as much green ink as you could find. It's so much fun reading these things. You can see the great selection of stills that they used for them. The perfect moments of each scene are captured, and it's so much fun to read. And all of the dialogue is included in these, and it's just like sitting down to read an episode. And as a kid, I found them incredibly entertaining, and as an adult, I find them a way to go home again.
How pissed were you that there's only 12 of them?
You know, I rather feel lucky that we had the 12 than be angry that we didn't have all of them.
Was there one that you really wanted that they didn't do?
Not really, because the main one that I destroyed the first time was Trouble with Tribbles.
Yeah.
And I ripped that thing apart reading it so much. I told David Gerald about that, and he was happy. But it's such a great thing that I would trace out of the books. I would trace the photos, and such wonderful memories of growing up with Star Trek, and this was a big connection to it.
I fell in love with A Taste of Armageddon because of the photo novel.
Interesting.
I don't know why. I love the photo novel of A Taste of Armageddon, which made me love. The episode was always middling for me, but then I realized it's my favorite meat and potatoes Star Trek episode because of the photo novel.
And you got a taste.
Rhea 6
you got a little taste.
Rhea 6 is luminous in the pages.
An entrance, but no exit.
It's funny. I fell in love with the photo novels all over again after we talked to Laszlo Palpas last year for the podcast, and I went and bought all of them again because there were a few I still didn't have, and I went on eBay and bought them, and I just can't get enough of those books. Obviously, they served a great purpose pre-home video, but I think they still are works of art. And all the way through the photo story of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, they're indispensable. Obviously, Star Trek Khan in black and white is very dispensable. But the motion picture one, which unfortunately is hard to keep, the glue they use for that, it's always falling apart on me. But that's a beautiful, beautiful photo novel, a motion picture.
Yeah. And of course, our biggest disappointment of Star Trek II being in black and white.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, but that's a great pick. And I think, such a classic, a key point in Star Trek history, certainly for a generation that grew up during the dark times when there was no new Star Trek. Well, I don't know if that necessarily, maybe the dark times.
History repeats itself.
Yeah, but
sometimes there's dark times when there is Star Trek.
But it was a really remarkable time, and the photo novels were remarkable books, and really a remarkable achievement at the time. The fact that they were all color and that they were fairly affordable. Yeah. At a time where most books were all, other than the covers, all in black and white. So it was pretty cool. Pretty cool. Okay. So that brings us to me and my honorary mention. And while I was inclined to pick the autobiography of Captain James T. Kirk by David Goodman, I'm not going to, because I got to recuse myself, because he mentions me as Captain, as Edith Keeler's landlord in the book. So I may be, which I love. But I do think it's a terrific book that takes all these great stories and tells a really wonderful story. And I know, David was supposed to do Spock, and for various reasons you can probably fathom, pulled out of that project. But but he did a really remarkable job on this. And this follows up on his book, Federation, the first 150 years, which was also a terrific book that he wrote. I'm amazed at the amount of work that he puts into these things. He never disappoints. So great work by David Goodman. But my pick, and we've talked about New Voyages before. We did a great episode. Certainly worth noting how significant this book was. I think we've talked about how important it was to us, but it's very hit or miss with the stories. So I'm not gonna go with that. My pick is a terrific book by A.C. Crispin, Yesterday's Sun, which was a sequel to All Our Yesterdays. Not the first episode you would expect to see a riveting sequel to, but again, it involves the Guardian of Forever and Spock going back to Sarapedon to find out that he has a son.
What was the name of that planet again?
Sarapedon.
Sarapedon.
No.
What did she be in?
Sarpedon.
It's just
Sarapedon.
Sarpedon.
He goes back to, well, maybe he went to the wrong planet. He goes back to Sarpedon to and finds out he has a son with Zarabeth. And it's a terrific, well-written, interesting story. It's a great Spock story. He goes back to Sarapedon. He goes back to Sarah Connor. Realizes that anyway. It's a terrific book. It was written sort of during that 80s heyday of timescape sci-fi back in the early to mid 80s, and just a wonderful book, wonderful what if kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And A.C. Crispin was another one of, you mentioned, Rob, so many of these luminaries of the novels, people who you could count on again and again who would write these great books. A.C. Crispin was definitely, in that rarefied air of great people who really knew how to write Star Trek, who had the voices of the characters, who had imaginative stories to tell. And I think there's few more imaginative stories than Yesterday's Sun. I have to say it was really a toss-up because I'm also a huge fan of the Gold Key archives that IDW did, which collected all those beautiful Gold Key comics. But I think since we've stuck mostly with the fiction books and avoided comics, I'm gonna pick Yesterday's Sun, which is my pick for honorary mention, which brings us to our pick for the number one best Star Trek fiction book of all time.
Indeed, it does.
I'm in suspense.
I'm gonna take the reins on this because we did it. We did a full episode a couple months ago with the daughter of Franz Josef Schnaubelt.
Do the honors.
Yes, we had a full episode with the daughter of Franz Josef Schnaubelt, and we talked extensively of the Star Trek blueprints and the Star Trek technical manual, which are basically the work of one man with input from
one man with a vision.
Knowledgeable fans, and look, in those dark times, this was a beacon of light to show us what existed beyond the show, beyond the stories that we were told. The entire universe spread out in front of us in this, specifically the technical manual, which had the Articles of Federation in it. It had, alien treaties in it. It had descriptions of all sorts of ships in the fleet. It had the the Earth equivalent schematics for the tricorder and the communicator. It was such a great window into this open world of Star Trek fandom that no one had attempted to create before. I remember first seeing the manual and opening the pages and saw all this depth of detail and interesting drawings and creativity, which was so fun to see. And yes, it's fiction. Yes, it's in our fiction list because it is fiction. I realize this. But the thing is, it feels real. It feels like it is documenting that world that we are only separated by time. And it's so wonderful to see, in the blueprints, the bowling alley and all the bathrooms that were not mentioned. It's so much fun and so much world building in these things.
Do you know what I also think should be mentioned is this is how Star Trek itself in our imaginations was transposed from one medium to another.
Yeah.
Because the idea that the whole conceit of these things is that they did come from the 23rd century.
Right.
And so I remember getting these, I was delighted that when you took out, from the plastic sleeve that it came in, you took out the Star Trek, Star Trek technical manual. It had the gold embossed Starfleet technical manual on it.
It was a real thing.
It was real. It was really from the 23rd century. And I got it when I was like 8. I was 8 when it came out. And getting that thing was literally like opening up the Ark of the Covenant or something. It was so magical because it completely, it never broke what it was supposed to be. It never broke character.
Yeah.
It was in character from the 23rd century the entire way through.
And as you're reading it, you're going, I knew it was real. I knew it was real. Just like the kids in Galaxy Quest.
It was unbelievable getting those two things. And it changed fandom for me because suddenly it wasn't just a TV show. Somebody had and I'll tell you, there's one other book I'd like to throw in there next to that, which was the Starfleet, Star Trek maps that came out in like 1980. Star Trek maps came out with these two cool posters that were
you had your honorary mention, Rob.
but the navigation book that came with Star Trek maps fit in with about how Starfleet ships are. It was the most insane thing I'd ever read, and it fit right in with the Franz Joseph technical.
Well, I think what you both came back to and focused on is that it made Star Trek real. And that is the achievement of the technical manual. All the thoughtfulness and hard work that Franz Joseph put into creating this, that it made the Star Trek universe real without any actors, without any score, without a story. It just took Star Trek, the world, like you said, we saw in our heads and expanded it. And created this playground for our imaginations that continues to this day. And that's why it's such a incomparable achievement and why it's our pick for #1 Star Trek book of all time.
Indeed. Fiction.
Okay. Fiction. Right.
What a great segue.
Asterisk fiction, which brings us to our nonfiction list. And we have some wonderful nonfiction to share with you, starting with number 10 and Robert Meyer Burnett. This is our list of the 10 greatest Star Trek nonfiction books of all time.
Well, I should say that the Star Trek nonfiction books was a thing I couldn't get enough of because, like with the Franz Joseph technical manual, it made Star Trek more real, even though it was nonfiction. It was always about how the show was made or different examples of various aspects of the show. And there's been Mark, I've got 2 shelves full of hardcovers and soft covers of these books. And again, Star Trek, how many of these are there? There's so many different books. And as you can tell, I'm stalling.
Well, because of course, your pick for number 10 is there are many great making of books for various Star Trek projects throughout the years.
Yes,
but
so
perhaps
the most interesting one, I would say, was William Shatner's daughter, Elizabeth, wrote her her experience of what it was like for her dad to make Star Trek V. And not only that, she recorded all these interviews with the cast and the crew. And so her book is not just a daughter's recollection of her father, but it's also a deep dive into the making of Star Trek, warts and all. Well, of course, it's more skewed toward her dad, but it doesn't shy away from some of the bad things that happened making that movie. And so how they didn't have enough money to make the end and how Shatner had written the original story. And it was a fascinating book. Now, we had Susan Sackett had done the making of Star Trek, the motion picture. There was the making of Star Trek 2. There's a brand new, beautiful making of Star Trek 2 book that came out a couple months ago. So there's still the books we bought 40 years ago or 41 years ago. There's new versions of them, new being published even today. But that account of the making of Star Trek V is singular and unique because you had the daughter of the man directing the movie, the daughter of the legend, the man, the myth, the legend, William Shatner, and she was able to give her account. So it's unlike any other making of book you'll ever read.
And how candid it is.
Yes, it's candid, and it's also because you're watching a daughter watch her father go through a crucible. Of directing this movie.
Which makes it unique.
Very unique. It's a really interesting book.
That's number 10, Captain's Log, The Making of the Final Frontier by Elizabeth Shatner and William Shatner. Darren, tell us what number 9 is on our list of best nonfiction Star Trek books.
Back in 1979, a man named Preston Neal Jones was tasked with interviewing all the people involved in the making of Star Trek, the motion picture, for Cinefantastique magazine. It was going to be a special issue. And what happened with that is nearly what happened with the movie. It never got finished. And Preston Neal Jones saved all these interviews, and years later, our friend Lucas Kendall was able to engage him into finishing the book, and our other friend Taylor White published it, and it became the book Return to Tomorrow. And it is a fascinating glimpse at the making of this challenged production, Star Trek the Motion Picture, and there's some fascinating interviews because most of them were done before the movie was finished. And that's quite the task, because no one knew what it was going to be. No one knew how it was going to turn out. It was basically the blind leading the blind at the time. And there's some fascinating interviews in there. Yeah. And it's really a great read.
Especially with Shatner.
Yeah, because it was written contemporaneous with the making of the film, but not released until nearly 40 years later. And of course, the reason it was not published in Cinefantastique is because the editor and publisher, Frederick Clark, decided to go with the black hole instead of Star Trek. And by the time that issue bombed, it was one of his least successful, he decided not to go with Star Trek because Star Trek was also considered not as successful as it could have, not entirely successful. And as a result, kept kicking that one down the road to the point where he never published it. Right. And it was only through the work of Taylor White and Lucas and Darren providing the cover that they were able to publish what is a terrific book.
Well, I read this book twice. I read it when I first had it. I read the whole book and then immediately started and read it again.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
It's great. I'm so happy that I was able to acquire the artwork that was painted for Cinefantastique for the issue, and was able to give that to them to put on the cover.
I wonder where you got that from.
It was eBay.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Oh. What's so great is this was sort of this legendary lost article for years. People kept asking Fred Clark, and when are you going to publish this? And even after the success of many of his Star Trek covers, he just, for whatever reason, never published it. Didn't think that there would be an audience for it, and of course there was, because the book sold out and was subsequently republished as an audiobook. So a terrific read, and a great look inside the troubled making of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. That brings us to number 8, Ashley Edward Miller.
It's another look inside, but this time it's a look inside Star Trek Deep Space Nine by Terry Erdman and Paula Block. Terry Erdman he was a film publicist. He spent 7 years on the set of Deep Space Nine, chronicling the entire process behind the making of that show. Everything from the writing to shooting. He spoke to the makeup effects people, the visual effects artists. He spoke to the directors, the actors. Basically, he was doing the Inglorious Treksperts, but it was totally focused on Deep Space Nine, and he turned it into a book, which is really great. And if you love Deep Space Nine, which you should, it is a book that you should have, because I sure do.
Yeah, it's a terrific look inside the making of that show. And there've been a lot of these books over the years, some of which I've written about episodic guidebooks to the various series. But I think this was a really towering achievement that Terry and Paula, who was head of licensing for Paramount, who had incredible access to the Deep Space Nine team, put together. And it's a really great look inside the making of that show. And certainly one of my favorite books about the making of any of these Star Trek series. Now that brings us to, we go from Deep Space Nine back into our way back museum, our way back time travel. We slingshot around the sun and go back to one of the earliest episode guidebooks. And of course, this is the legendary B. Joe Trimble's Star Trek Concordance, which he originally published as a fanzine and was later released as a oversized paperback. And for those of you who bought it in the early to mid 70s, you'll remember it had this wheel with the episodes on it. And what was so unique about it, it was an episode guide. This is long before IMDb or Wikipedia. So it was a guide to all the episodes, the original Star Trek and the animated series with illustrations. There was nothing else like it. It was an indispensable book, and it was nicely packaged with an image of the primary hull on the cover and this wonderful spinner wheel, which would take you to the star dates and the episodes. And just a terrific book by what a lot of people call Star Trek's first fan, B. Joe Trimble.
That's how I remembered I taught myself all the episode titles with that spinner.
Nice.
100%, right?
I test myself with it.
Yeah. And that was where you learned like the order, because in watching the syndication, who knew what order they were made
Yeah,
in?
that was the first. Yeah, didn't know.
This is a book I think that doesn't necessarily get the love or people remember because there've been so many episode guidebooks since, but it was first, and it may not be the best, but it was first, and it was the most significant.
And it had like an encyclopedia in the back too that had all these.
Yes, it did.
It was great.
And I still have it.
I do too.
It's my dog-eared copy of it, right next to the dog-faced boy.
And Beecher herself is awesome, by the way. And she was a fan when it was hard.
Yep, 100%. Brings us to number 6 on our list. Robert Meyer Burnett, tell us what we're reading in the number 6 position.
Well, I would say that this deals with a certain subject matter that I actually read a first book by guys named Ed Gross and Mark Altman. No,
that was just Ed. That was not me.
Oh, was it just Ed? It wasn't you? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then they combined them too, because there's one with the both of you. I guess it's the Lost. It's multiple.
I know there are books that my name is on that I know nothing about.
Yeah,
that I've never heard of.
So again, our favorite
residuals.
Judith and Garfield Reeve Stevens wrote the definitive story of the unmade Star Trek Phase 2 TV series that was actually getting very close to production before it was canceled, and Star Trek the Motion Picture was made instead. And a lot of people don't know. There were 13 scripts that they wrote for this series that later 2 of them were made into episodes of The Next Generation. The Child
and Devil's Due.
And also James Cawley's Star Trek fan series, Star Trek New Voyages or Star Trek Phase 2, they did Katoomba, which is another. So you can see 3 of the scripts that were actually written for this show. But it talks about the whole painful history of the making or the unmaking of the Star Trek TV series that was not.
Well, technically, you can see 4 of them because one of them became Star Trek the Motion Picture as well.
Well, that's true. The God thing, but yeah, the in
Robots
the image.
Return.
In the image.
Robots
yeah.
Return.
In the image,
yeah.
right, yeah.
But yeah, so that's true. And it's a fascinating book, and I love reading it, and I love seeing all the artwork and everything they had in it. And it's a very thick book. It's hard to find, but worth a read. And the Reeve Stevens, one of their many Star Trek. Well, they've written more than one. This is not the only Star Trek nonfiction book.
But it's the best of them.
It is.
It was the best of the tyrants.
It was, and there's some great illustrations and archival photos and storyboards and illustrations. It's the most comprehensive. As you alluded to, Ed Gross wrote a terrific book, and the first book covering the Lost the series. But I think because they had access to Paramount and the Paramount archives, and this is the most complete. And it's a terrific book, and it really fills in sort of a missing puzzle piece in the very long and serpentine history of Star Trek. That brings us to number 5 on our list. Darren, what's number 5?
We had a whole episode with the author on this. We had the wonderful Walter Koenig in studio back when we were in the studio. And he talked about his book, Chekhov's Enterprise, which is basically his daily diary entries during the production of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And it's really a fascinating look as to, the limited amount of information that the actors received when they were on this movie. It's so interesting to see his perspective and see what his reactions to everything were. The description of him wanting to kiss Persis Kambata's head and getting makeup on his teeth was just an amazing scene and one of my favorites. His great humorous down-home style is really put full force here, and it's as if you're just hanging out with him every day on the set, and his trials and tribulations of dealing with screaming for a whole week, and it's really a lot of fun, and it's a great sort of peek into this world that we never get to see.
Yeah. And I think it's another interesting peeling back the curtain of something contemporaneous. And it's a nice companion piece to Preston's book, Return to Tomorrow. But we really get a sense of what it was like to be on the set. Because we've seen so many of these stories evolve over time at the conventions, and people tell very different stories than they tell now. And this was him writing it in 1978. 1979, and it's a terrific book, and I think Walter was surprised.
It's bound to be at least 65% more true than the stories now.
100%. That's what they should put on the reissue. 65% more true than any other book about Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Okay, that was number 5, Chekhov's Enterprise by Walter Koenig, and that brings us to Ashley and number 4.
Coming in at number 4, have you ever wondered what it's like to be a television writer in Hollywood? God knows I have. Number 4 is The Making of the Trouble with Tribbles by David Gerrold, which is a really fascinating look at what it is like, what it was like to, first of all, to go in and pitch that show, to write for that show at that time with that episode, to get the perspective of somebody who turned in what turned out to be a classic that is so beloved and so well remembered. It was revisited, 25 years later on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, putting in that plug. It's a really great read because David Gerrold, he's a pretty good writer. And it's just a different way of looking at what it was like to be a part of things then. So, if you've got some of the writers who have come into this from the outside, kind of interviewing people and talking to people and asking about their jobs, you've got Walter Koenig giving you the perspective of being an actor on the set. Here comes David Gerrold letting you know what it's like to be a writer in these situations and live in a constant state of fear that you will be made to look like an asshole by 300 people.
Yeah, I remember this is going every couple of weeks to the bookstore to see what new Star Trek books they had. Yeah. And coming across The Making of the Trouble with Tribbles for the first time, which I immediately bought with my allowance or my babysitting money or whatever it was. And I found it fascinating because you got to remember, this is the time where, other than the Jaws log and The Making of 2001, you didn't really know much about how the sausage was made. And this book completely goes into detail. You really get to meet Gene Kuhn. You get to see various iterations of how the script evolved, the whole process of the fuzzies and how he pitched the show, and then how the treatment and the outline evolved. And his experience on set. There's a wonderful black and white photo signature of photos from behind the scenes. And it's just, particularly for those of us who ended up becoming writers, a really great peeling back the curtain and showing how the television business works. That's how it worked then. It's kind of how it works now.
Yeah. It's not a hell of a lot different.
Great book.
Great book. And Rob, that brings us to number 3 as we get down to our final 3 best Star Trek nonfiction books.
Well, it's funny because one of my favorite books that's come out in the last, I guess, the teens was I Want My MTV, the uncensored oral history of MTV. And that book, the way it's structured is it's just people talking and it's intercut. It's like if you're watching a documentary, it's intercut with just people's conversations. And I always thought to myself, gosh, I'd love to read books like that about like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or James Bond or maybe Star Trek. I wonder if somebody could do a book like that. And not only is there one book, it's a 2-volume hardcover set. And I love my Star Trek reference books in hardcover that celebrates, it was done for the 50th anniversary. And it's called The 50-Year Mission. And it's the oral history of Star Trek, going from the very beginning of the franchise all the way up to where we were.
Rob just likes it because it is oral in the title.
That's right. And it just happens to be written by longtime collaborators Mark A. Altman and Edward Gross. And I think I was first made aware of Ed Gross because I bought a book that he wrote on Wise Guy. And so I don't even think I knew that you guys were friends then. I think I got that book before. I'm not sure. But so it's a fascinating, first of all, I mean, I hope this isn't disparaging, but if you're going to the bathroom, it's a perfect book to have because you can pick it up and read it in chunks. You can't, maybe that was the wrong word. But I'm just
perhaps you should rephrase that, laddie.
It's like you said the book is number 2. It's number 3. So
it's a great fun book to read. It's compulsively readable. It'll put a big smile on your face, but you don't have to if you only have 15 minutes to read, you'll get something out of it. And it's a terrific 2-volume set, and I can't recommend it highly enough.
Manly, yes, but I like it too.
I think it's not too bad either. Look, originally this started as one book. It was so long that when Ed and I sent it to our editor, we said, look, it's a lot longer than we were contracted for. I hope you'll consider splitting into 2 books. He found that an outrageous concept. He said, I'll be the judge of that. He read it. And on Monday, we got an email saying it's 2 books. So that was the biggest.
1 book?
I'm very proud of those books. I'm very proud of the response we got. And that hopefully we set the record straight and told stories that people never heard. And in a lot of ways, the 50-Year Mission was the inspiration for this podcast. So,
and I would say, all of those books, whether it's Galactica, whether it was Buffy, whether it was Bond, all of your oral history books are essential reading.
Well, thank you, Rob. And that brings us to number 2, to a really remarkable achievement by Mike and Denise Okuda. This was, in its original iteration, a staggering accomplishment. It's even more impressive in their revised version, in which they basically chronicle the entire history of the Star Trek universe in one giant encyclopedia. And only somebody as anal as Mike Okuda and Denise could have pulled this off, because the attention to detail and is simply remarkable. This book is a triumphant achievement. It's all of Star Trek in one package, and it's a must-own for anyone who is a fan of the franchise.
It's the T'Pau of Star Trek books.
And you have to. This book is way out of print. It's hideously expensive on the secondary market, but it's worth picking up. It's a 2-volume hardcover in a slipcase. Slipcase,
cardboard slipcase. It's
this
amazing.
Book is unbelievable, and all the graphics in it and all the work that was done. It is absolutely astonishing. And
well, they created all this new in-universe graphics that didn't exist to illustrate a lot of the listings.
Yeah. And what's great about it is it was published in 2016. I'm just going to let you guys go with that. 2016. So it's all pure. It's pure.
Oh, I see.
Do we need? That's funny. Do we need to explain to our listeners what an encyclopedia is?
Maybe so.
You see, back in the ancient times, there were salesmen who would go door to door and selling
information,
huge volumes of information books. Some 20 to 30 editions of them. And they were a collection of books that your parents would proudly have on the shelves, and you would almost never look into. But I remember looking at the encyclopedias regular encyclopedias in my school library and just looking through them just for fun, because I was a geek like that. But the Star Trek encyclopedias are so much fun to delve into and really see the care with which every entry is interwoven with the other, and they all fit together in a brilliant couple of volumes.
I just want to say that there's a collectible version of it on Amazon right now for $1,500.
Wow.
Yeah, the next one is $666.66.
Wow.
Apparently it's time to sell my Star Trek encyclopedia.
I was going to say, if only Mike and Denise were benefiting from that, but unfortunately they are not.
Why doesn't Titan republish this beautiful book?
Well, because they would want to update it, and then it's worthless.
Don't do that.
They don't want to update it. It doesn't need updating.
All canonical. All the
part of the
great
show.
Work of canonical. I can only imagine the guys over at Star Trek Online. They're, damn it, what do we have to do now? They didn't have to do that for this encyclopedia.
Oh my God, that is so funny. Well, that brings us, before we reveal our number one Star Trek nonfiction book of all time, to our honorary mentions. So, Ashley, what's your pick for honorary mention?
My pick is The Rules of Acquisition by Ira Stephen Bear and Robert Hewitt Wolfe, which collects all of the Ferengi wit and wisdom over the years, so that you too can benefit, from life lessons like war is good for business. Peace is good for business. You can learn the parable of the smiling partner. I mean, there's so many things that you can learn from this book. It's tongue in cheek, quite obviously, and a lot of it ends up getting referenced in the show. And hey, you know what? If you go out and you buy the book, if you can find the book, like the A-Team, you put a few bucks in their pockets. Why not?
Fantastic. That's a fun book. It's a fun book. Rules of Acquisition. You could tell on the show they were having a lot of fun with those Rules of Acquisition. Totally. What about you, Rob? What's your honorary mention?
Yeah, this is a wacky book, but it came out in just before Star Trek: The Motion Picture came out, and it's by Susan Sackett, Fred Goldstein, and Stan Goldstein. It's called Star Trek Speaks, and all it is a collection of various quotes from all the episodes of the original series, organized into things like religion or war or philosophy. I love this book. It has a terrible purple cover. It just says Star Trek Speaks. It's the dumbest cover ever. I don't know why, but I probably read, to me, people might, whether you're reading Anthony Robbins, whether you're reading Jordan Peterson, who the hell your guru is. Mm-hmm. This book was my self-help book when I was 12. I had literally had this book by my bedside, and I opened it all the time for my daily affirmation, my daily Trek affirmation.
Rob would go and say, "We the people," and they say, "What's that?" And he says, "That's a quote from Star Trek." Oh,
yeah, it's true. But I love this book. I love that somebody even made this book, and it was published by Wallaby, which is Star Trek: The Motion Picture came out, and Wallaby was publishing. They're part of Simon & Schuster.
Well, I mean, it was literally after the success of Star Wars. When Motion Picture came out, there were so many books tied into Star Trek, which almost all failed. And yet a lot of them are terrific. 78, 79, 80, there were so many books. Star Trek Aliens and all this stuff, and space flight chronology and all this crazy stuff.
Oh, that book was one of the great. I should have said that, but that's that's
non-canon.
Right.
That's
not canon at the time.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. It was all in color. Yeah, we should get Rick Stern back on the show to talk about that.
So good.
Yeah. Okay. That was a great book. You're right. Okay. That brings us now to Darren and his honorary mention before we reveal the number one pick for best Star Trek book nonfiction.
My honorary mention is, I'm surprised that none of us had thought of this before, but I realized it during this episode that we didn't pick the only book written by an Organian.
Oh, well, that was going to be my honory mention. So you're not as clever as you thought you were.
Well, actually, I am because I went first. But, the great Rafe Needleman at age 12 wrote the official Star Trek trivia book. And it's so much fun. And I still have my copy, which I wrote in the first page, Vulcan, and my score. It's so much fun to go through and see, oh, well, he got that question wrong and things like that, which is, the sort of the creation of the unhappy fan. But it's so much fun to delve into the mind of this young man as to what he thought was important to mention in a trivia book. And I loved it. I still love it. And I'm so happy that we got to connect with him.
I have to say, of all the many souls we've encountered in our travels as Treksperts, I mean, Andre Kindred, which was just remarkable, and so many of the cast, I think to this day still, the most remarkable experience was us having fun at Rafe Needleman's expense on the podcast and making fun of the book and the fact that he called himself an Organian, only to have him listening on, in his car.
Because Organians hear everything. Don't you understand?
Just call us and say, I am Rafe Needleman, and having him fly down to be on the show. And then we got to bring him to Las Vegas to have him do it live on stage great. At the Creation Grand Slam or whatever the hell they call it now. And that was simply remarkable. Eddie Egan's another one of those people. Like, I'm still my mind blown. Like Rob, that we got to meet and hang out with Eddie Egan. But the Rafe Needleman thing was just nuts. So, that's a great pick, Darren.
I'm sorry,
and it was going to be my pick.
Honorable.
Look, the great thing about Star Trek nonfiction is, even though you took my pick, there's so many other great choices. And before I reveal my pick, I just want to acknowledge the passing of the late, great Alan Asherman. Alan Asherman was a remarkable chronicler of Star Trek in its infancy. He worked alongside Doug Drexler, I believe, at the Federation Trading Post. He was involved in the official Star Trek the official Star Trek movie posters. What was it called? The poster book.
Yeah, the poster book.
Star Trek book, which was also the bedrock of our early fandom.
Yeah.
And I will admit now that it was. Many of those were on the walls of my room growing up. And the Day of the Dove one, I know. The Tholian Web, I believe I had up on my wall. But he wrote a couple of great books. He wrote the Star Trek Companion, I believe it was. But there's a book that he's not as well known for because he's done a bunch of great books. But the one that I think is the most impressive that he isn't talked about because it went out of print many, many years ago, is The Making of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which is a terrific book that he did. Because I thought Susan and Jean's Making of Star Trek the Motion Picture is good, but Star Trek II, it goes into all the early scripts. It goes into really amazing detail about the production of the film. And, Alan passed away recently, and it's again, he's part of what they call first fandom, which is rapidly diminishing. Yeah. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that we stand on the shoulder of giants, someone who's been a Trek journalist for so many years. He was certainly one of the people I look to as one of the legends of this wacky world of Star Trek journalism.
His book was the Star Trek Compendium.
Thank you. The Compendium. The Companion.
And it was, he got to update it throughout the various movies too.
Indeed.
Yes, he did. And he wrote a bunch of books. I'm missing a whole bunch of them.
The interview book. He did the interview book.
Oh, of course.
Star Trek interview book.
Yeah, that's right. He interviewed most of the cast for that.
Yeah.
And so he did great work. He also wrote a bunch of articles about Star Trek, and he was a diehard Star Trek fan, and obviously a real loss when he passed away a couple of months ago this year. And we're sad to say that. So many other books to choose from. David Gerrold's The World of Star Trek, Star Trek Lives, about the conventions, Letters to Star Trek, Susan Sackett's wonderful a collection of mail to Gene and to Star Trek and the actors. But my pick for honorary mention is going to be the Best of Trek collections from G.B. Love.
Oh, dude, good call, brother.
These were unauthorized, unsanctioned books published by, I think it was New American Library. Signet, which was not a licensee.
What is library?
But they did it by calling it. They said it was based on the magazine Trek magazine, of which I think there were a couple issues, which maybe a couple articles came from this Trek magazine.
Yeah.
But it went on long after Trek magazine was long gone, was space dust, and this was an enormous collection of musings about Star Trek. We talked about this in a previous episode, not one of our stellar moments, but it is a terrific thing. They did best episodes. They did a lot of canon. They tried to explain lapses in canon or reconcile canon.
They had Leslie Thompson, Star Trek Mysteries Solved. Mark, I cannot tell you how much I lived for these books. And they were also scholarly. Like if you were in college, it felt like a lot of people that were in college were writing essays about like Spock's soul, the soul of Spock, and would write these musings on Star Trek as if it was high art, high literature. And I was so there for it. And I couldn't get enough.
They did this long article on the Klingon-Romulan alliance explaining the whole thing. And I'm just like, this is great.
The Romulans were using a D7 battlecruiser.
Yeah, which was name-checked in Enterprise Incident. But then they explained the whole history of the Klingon-Romulan. There was more thought put into these, dare I say, fakakta little essays, than are put into most of the Star Trek shows today.
But the funny thing is, as fans, we read all this stuff, so our minds were full of all of it.
Yeah, they were full of it.
Well, that's why it's hard, though. It's hard to go back and watch something that isn't as considered as a volume of the Best of Trek was.
Yeah.
And I understand no one should be expected to write like that. But if you're working on something that's as long, Star Trek's going to be 57 years old. Or just turned 57 in September. We'll be 58 next year. I mean, no one can be expected to know these things, especially most writers are in their 30s, 40s. I mean, who's going to go back and no one, unless you grew up like this, no one's as crazy as we are.
Well, that much is certain.
That much is certain.
So 100%. Those are all great picks. And we could probably do another 20, but we're not going to because we're about to reveal the number one greatest Star Trek nonfiction book of all time. And to do the honors is none other than its writer, Gene Roddenberry.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's so good to be here after so many years of being dead. The wonderful thing about Star Trek nonfiction book is that it brings my coffers much more money than the fiction books do. Primarily because I was so involved at doing interviews for this first book in your list, The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield, otherwise known as Stephen Edward Poe, and myself, Gene Roddenberry. You'll know that whenever I speak in the book, it is all in capital letters. So you'll know it is indeed the great bird speaking my wonderful thoughts directly into your head. And The project started in the second season and proceeded through the third season, and it's a wonderful look for everyone to get an idea of what it was to work on the science fiction show Star Trek, and I'm very proud of it. And it's, we wrote on the book, it's the book of how to write for TV. And I think that that is not only a true statement, but also a bold statement, because so many people were inspired by this book to do careers in television and entertainment as well. And I think that it's a great book to stir your imagination about things beyond the screen and things that happened in the real world to create the fantasies that you so enjoy.
Well, it was certainly a gateway drug for me to work in TV. Ashley, I'm sure it was for you as well.
Yeah, look, 100%. I read this book cover to cover again and again and again and again. Like, I don't think I read any Star Trek book at all the way that I read this. Like, the spine of this book with like the silver cover was destroyed with like, and just like, I remember the Enterprise, that shot of her with like the phasers coming out and just that kooky ass font. Although I will say, I remember how it said like for writing TV, having written TV, I don't know that it's all that great, like a primer on how to write for TV, but I'll tell you what it is. It is a really great book about producing television.
Yes, how to make TV.
Yeah, how to make it. Like, if you like know what you're reading, and even if you don't, like what you come away appreciating, what I came away appreciating was the degree of problem solving that was happening in creating the future. The salt shaker thing, for example, the simple way you make props, the reason why you invent transporters, all of the things that they had to go through when they were creating this world, but they also had to create it in the context of making a television show.
Right.
Every single week. What a great education that book is in how to think like a producer. I love it. It's hands down my favorite Star Trek book ever written.
And the absolute brilliance of Bob Justman. He comes through in all his memos as being really the driving force behind all of this and the reason why it was made.
Yep,
100%. 100%.
And it wasn't just, this also gave me a greater appreciation for the entire industry, not just TV and Star Trek, but motion pictures and the making of this kind of, this is such a cornerstone, foundational tome in my own life in terms of setting me on the path of even wanting, like, I never wanted to be an actor. I never wanted to be in front of the camera, because this book was like, I wanted to go be a part of this business, this. Yeah. And this book, it cannot be stressed enough how important this book was probably to all of us.
This was Devil's Tower. This was the eddies and currents that brought us all here. It was this book. This was the catalyst. Darren, it shows all the sketches and production illustrations and storyboards and the amazing production design of the show. It must be hugely influential for you.
The guy getting zapped in the...
It's amazing. Look, a lot of people are fans of Star Trek, the fiction show. They are fans of the characters and of the stories. I like those things, but this is where my fandom is. My fandom is for the people who made the show and how they did it and everything that went into it. That is what I've always been a fan of. And this was the cornerstone for all of that.
100%. This was another book that like you were saying, Ashley, I reread this book 100 times.
Yeah.
And again, I started from, I probably had this book when I was 7.
Yeah.
Whenever I didn't have the first edition, but it was bought for me later. And I think I went through 3 or 4 copies of it. It just kept falling apart.
It kept falling apart. Yep.
Yeah.
It's a big, bulky book.
And then you wanted to look at the pictures. I looked at the pictures for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours.
And I feel like the picture pages were actually on better paper.
Yes, they were on a heavier bond so that they wouldn't disintegrate.
They would hold the ink.
I can confirm that there is a a recording of the audiobook of this book that I did that is nearly 27 hours long.
Jesus.
And I'm just waiting for that moment where I can put it out there, because it has so influenced my life and career and enjoyment that I wanted to document it some way.
Yeah.
Did you do it as Gene Roddenberry?
Every character.
Wow.
Every character.
That's remarkable.
You should probably
That's
get that
remarkable.
one. Why don't you let them license that to you so you can put it out officially?
Well,
Okay.
I have to, if I have the time, Doctor.
If he has the time.
I got it.
It's interesting because it says the book to write TV. That's really David Gerald's book on Tribbles, is how to write TV.
That's true.
Yes.
This is how to make TV, and it includes production design and props and visual effects
and
writing
schedules.
and producing and and schedules. Exactly. So it's the whole package, the whole Megillah.
Well, both of those books, I saw them as two sides of the same coin when I was growing up. I mean, they complemented each other very, very well.
But look, all of us, who work in this business. And that was the amazing thing I found when I was interviewing people for a 50-year mission, the number 3 book on our list. I found that everyone I talked to, almost everyone I talked to, had been hugely influenced by that book. So, who are fans. Mike Sussman, Dave Goodman, so many of these people that I talked to who'd worked on Star Trek, that was the equation. It all went back to making Star Trek. I think for Brandon, it was the Jaws log. But for almost everyone else, particularly the ones who were Ron Moore, all the people who were dedicated, diehard Star Trek fans, making a Star Trek said, oh, this is a career. This is something I can do. And
during my short tenure on Voyager, working on the pilot, I found that there was this man going around interviewing people for a making of Voyager.
Yeah.
And I found out that this man was Stephen Edward Poe, which I thought was fine. Then someone told me, well, you know who that is? That's Stephen Whitfield. I went, what? And I was floored, and I got to be interviewed by him, and I got to tell him how much the book influenced me. And unfortunately, he died very shortly after that. But it was such a great connection to all of that I got to experience, which I'm eternally grateful for.
By the way, that book on the making of Voyager he wrote was published.
Yes,
and
it was.
Quite good.
Yeah, it's quite good.
Didn't make our list, but it's quite good. No.
That's okay. He made number 1 with a bullet.
I also think those Terry Erdman and Paula Block 365 or whatever they're called, those are good. Those photo books where it's just like a photo from each episode.
Yep.
Like those are fun. They did that for the original series Next Gen, I think, only.
Yeah.
I don't think, but both those are great books. So, they're fun. They're good. Anyway, we could go on and on, but we're not going to because we won't. I see, Darren, you have Max Every's book, A Masterpiece in Disarray, sitting there in your office.
Yes, I do.
Which is, you can hear our interview with Max on Deck 78 this week. What do you think of the book so far?
It's worth 10 times its weight in water.
Rob, have you've read it? Yeah.
I'm in the middle of it.
You should have him on your show. We'll put you in touch if you're interested.
Oh, I would love this.
He's a good guest, and the book is
amazing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, okay. Well, when we're off the air, we'll have to put you in touch because I know he was a good guest. He had good stories, and he's so anxious to get the word out, and it deserves it because it's our number 1 book about the making of Dune.
In a list of 2 books.
4.
It's really interesting because I had, a 20-year career making special features for movies. I worked on Lord of the Rings and X-Men and Narnia and Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I can't tell you how much these Star Trek reference books influenced what I was trying to do when I was doing these interviews, interviewing. It's funny. I was just putting up on Instagram, for the 25th anniversary of Star Trek: The Next Generation, I did this roundtable conversation with the whole cast. And people, not many people have the Blu-rays, and they haven't seen this stuff disappears.
Yeah,
and there's no way
it's ephemeral.
It is, and it was released.
Paramount Plus should air that stuff.
Well, it's all
like
in
the
HD.
Roddenberry Vault and all the stuff you shot. Because I know we need to go, but I have to say, since you brought it up, the work that you did with Roger on the Star Trek documentaries, Enterprise and Next Gen, is so great. Because you got to remember, the stuff that preceded it, that Donald Beck stuff, was awful, right? It was awful. And then Rob and Roger come along and they do this fantastic bonus content for these discs that's just superb. And people haven't seen it.
No, and I'm surprised they don't put it on Paramount Plus because it was all finished in HD. It's all 30-minute chunks. And
sure,
Rob, they can't put Star Trek on Paramount Plus.
Yeah. No, but it's frustrating. I mean, and because I wonder, like, will people are young people going to be inspired by things the way we were by these making of these books? I just don't think people are.
Well, people I don't think are reading making of. I know people, because I haven't done any of these oral histories now in a couple of years, but I know Ed is continuing to, Peter Holstrom, who hosts the TREKSPERTS briefing room, and they're not selling like they used to, because I think that the way we were voracious in our appetites to read anything about the movies we loved, people aren't as interested. The same reason why they're not clamoring for special features, where streaming is enough for them. They don't need the Blu-ray. They don't need the 4K because they don't care about the special feature. And it's sad because it was not enough to just watch these shows. We want to know how they were made.
Right. And they don't value it as art.
No, absolutely.
They value the piece itself as ephemera, right?
It's content, it's not art.
Yeah. And that's a crying shame.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, I mean, we all came to this stuff when we were kids. Yeah. You know, I mean, like you said, Mark, you used your allowance to buy these books. I can just imagine, a kid today is like, what, you used money when you were a kid, the money you had to buy books?
It's like the bakery, I can buy a black and white cookie, or I can buy a Star Trek book for $1.85. Well, I think I'm going to go with the Star Trek book.
Yeah.
It's the last time I made that decision.
Are you blind? That cookie is black on the left side.
Yeah, exactly. Let that be your last battlefield cookie. Although I was told today by my daughter that apparently you're not supposed to call it a black and white cookie anymore. That it's called, not that she said, but people are calling it a moon cookie. That apparently the kids today aren't calling it black and white. I said, why not? It's like Seinfeld said, it's black and white coming together in unity for a common cause, for greatness, to be a deliciousness. Why would you not call it a black and white cookie? It's great. It's black and white cookie, moon cookie.
Because they're rushing to find something to virtue signal about because they need the next hit.
If it's a moon cookie, it needs to have Moonbase Alpha on it.
Although I do like, to be honest, the dark and light side of the moon. That's pretty cool. Because then you can go, here's where the nuclear waste dump was, and here's where Moonbase Alpha was.
Yeah.
And if your cookie explodes and breaks orbit.
And now it's time for our 10 Best Space 1999 books. Did you read
Coming in at number one?
I have a few of them. There's a couple of really good new ones that have been recently published.
It was great. But at the time, in the 70s, you had the Moonbase Alpha technical manual you bought in Starlog, right?
Which I have a mint condition of right there.
And how many of you had paperbacks of the novelizations?
Oh, yeah. Guardian of Tyrion,
the pictures on the cover? They had pictures on the cover?
I had nothing, but I had a cardboard eagle kit.
Yeah. Well, they recently published the Moonbase Alpha technical manual in a hardcover.
Oh, well, it's great. I know. I have it. It's great.
It's fantastic. And UFO. There's a UFO one.
All that stuff that Jamie's doing is fantastic.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I know. Ashley's like, how do we end the show? Well, I'll tell you how. We're going to end it right now. We're going to say thank you, everyone, for joining us for our third holiday special. That means there's 7 to go. 7 more great top 10 lists. I bet you're wondering what they're going to be. The only way to find out is to keep listening here at the Inglorious Treksperts. And of course, you may have opinions that you want to share. You can do that through social, Inglorious Trek, Inglorious Treksperts, on all the usual social channels. But I can't promise we're interested in your opinion, but you can share it anyway.
There's only 28 hours left.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Longer than Darren's read of the making of Star Trek.
But we're so delighted that you continue to join us for these insane specials. And I hope you're enjoying this year's. A deep, deep appreciation to Mark Rivera, Peter Holmstrom for all their help in making these possible. Mark, we know we've given you a lot of content to get through your Pro Tools, but we appreciate it and thank you for that. There's no bigger fan of the Treksperts than Mark Rivera, and there's no bigger fan of Mark Rivera than the Treksperts. So thank you. And that's going to be about it. Rob, thank you again for joining us. It's great to have you back on the show.
Miss it. It's a holiday tradition.
It's a holiday tradition. There's just a few things you can always count on. The Grinch, Die Hard, and Rob Burnett joining the holiday special at Inglorious Treksperts. And of course, if you can't get enough of Rob, check out the Burnettwork daily on YouTube, even when he has COVID.
It's true. And if I'm not there, someone else will be there.
See, that's how much he cares about you. Even when he's sick,
right.
he's still recording episodes.
That's right.
Because he loves you. He loves his fans. That makes one of us.
Tomorrow's episode will be all dogs wandering around, but
it will. There's 11 dogs in my house. 11.
It's a dog-eat-dog world.
We have 7 puppies. If you want them, take them.
Oh God!
But no, it's been great to do these. They're a lot of fun, and people love these. I mean,
people love them.
People give us more positive feedback on these shows, and that's what's so great to hear.
I just don't know what we're going to do next year.
The 100.
Luckily, we don't have to figure it out right now.
Yeah, that's true. We don't have to figure out right now. But what we do have to do now is say, on behalf of Robert Meyer Burnett, Ashley Edward Miller, Daren Dochterman, and myself, Mark A. Altman, co-author of the number 3, Keep on Trekking, Ingloriously, of course.
Prospero año y felicidad.
I wanna wish you a Merry Christmas. I wanna wish you a Merry Christmas. I wanna wish you a Merry Christmas from the bottom of my heart.
Feliz Navidad. Feliz Navidad. Feliz Navidad.